I paid for my brother's wedding, then he told everyone I was just a guest. So I took back the gift at the reception. My brother Caleb is 30, I'm 37, and for most of our lives have been less of a sister and more of whatever role was missing at the time. Driver, babysitter, homework checker, emergency contact, backup parent, ATM. If something went wrong in Caleb's life, somehow it rolled downhill until it landed at my feet. That probably sounds harsher than I mean it to, because I did love him. I still do, in the way you love somebody who has spent years making affection feel like a bill that keeps coming due. We grew up outside St. Louis in a town where everybody knew exactly how much money everybody else did or didn't have. My dad, Ron, worked HVAC until his knees gave out. My mom, Denise, spent 20 years at the front desk of a dental office and could stretch a dollar so far it should have qualified as a magic trick. Caleb was the baby of the family, 7 years younger than me, blonde and charming and somehow always looking like he had just narrowly escaped consequences. I was the opposite, dark hair, serious face, the kid who remembered permission slips and dentist appointments and when the electric bill was due. When I was 16, I was reminding my father that Caleb needed to be picked up from Little League. By the time I was in college, I was coming home on weekends to help mom grocery shop and make sure Caleb had school clothes that actually fit. Nobody ever officially asked me to become the reliable one. It just happened the same way mold happens in a damp basement. Quietly, then all at once. Caleb and I weren't enemies. That's what made the whole thing worse. If he had been openly awful from the beginning, I think I would have built some emotional calluses. But Caleb was warm when he needed something, funny when people were watching, affectionate in flashes. He'd call me, Mel, in that little boy voice he used when he was trying to get away with something. He'd hug me, tell me I was the only person who ever really had his back, and I'd feel 12 different resentments at once while still saying yes. When he met Jenna, everybody acted like he'd finally become an adult. Jenna was 28, pretty in a polished, intentional way, the kind of woman who always had her nails done and somehow made athleisure look expensive. She was a realtor for a boutique agency in St. Charles, came from a family with more money than ours, and had very strong opinions about aesthetics. That's probably the nicest way I can put it. Their relationship moved fast. They were together maybe 11 months before he proposed at a winery with a photographer hiding behind a hedge like he was documenting a hostage exchange. Mom cried over the pictures. Dad said, "Well, guess that's that," in the tone of a man accepting weather he could not control. I sent them a Le Creuset Dutch oven from their registry and thought that would be the extent of my involvement. I was wrong. About 6 weeks after they got engaged, Caleb called me on a Tuesday night at around 9:30. I remember because I was in my apartment eating Thai leftovers standing at my kitchen counter, still in work clothes. I work in operations for a medical distribution company, which means I spend all day solving other people's problems in a blazer and then come home too tired to do anything except microwave rice. He sounded weirdly subdued. "Hey, Mel, hey, everything okay?" "Yeah, I mean, sort of, can you talk?" That phrase from Caleb usually meant two things. He needed money, or he had done something stupid and wanted me to help fix it. I leaned against the counter. "What happened?" He exhaled like a man preparing to confess to manslaughter. "So, we found the venue. Okay? It's perfect. It's exactly what Jenna wanted. Old stone house, vineyard, the whole thing. We put down a hold, but the deposit is due Friday." There was a pause where I could practically hear him waiting for me to volunteer the next line. "I didn't," I said, and we're short. "By how much?" Another pause. "For the deposit, $8,000. I almost laughed because I truly thought I must have misheard him. $8,000? Mel, don't do that. Don't do what? The tone. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Caleb, there are not a lot of tones available to a person who has just been told somebody needs $8,000 by Friday. He started talking faster then, the way he does when he's trying to outrun the stupidity of a situation. Jenna's parents were paying for the rehearsal dinner. Our parents were embarrassed because they couldn't contribute much. Prices were insane. They had already sent save the dates. If they lost the venue, Jenna would be devastated. Could I loan them the deposit just for a little while until they figured things out? Loan. I asked when he expected to pay me back, and he got quiet again. That was answer enough. I should have said no. I know that. Even typing this out, I know exactly where any sane person would say I went wrong. But my brother sounded scared, and somewhere under all my annoyance there is this deeply stupid soft spot I have for him that still lights up when he sounds like a kid asking me to fix something he broke. I asked for the full wedding budget. He hesitated, then sent it. I stared at the spreadsheet on my phone for a solid 10 minutes. Venue, catering, bar package, photographer, florist, DJ, rentals, cake, transportation, hair and makeup, signage. It was not a wedding within their means. Not even remotely. It was a wedding designed by Pinterest and delusion. The next night I drove to my parents' house because I wanted to hear them say out loud what they expected from me. Mom already had her worried face on when I walked in. Dad was pretending to watch a Cardinals game with the volume too high. Caleb and Jenna came 20 minutes later carrying coffees like this was a business meeting. It basically was. Jenna did most of the talking at first. She was stressed. The market had been weird. Caleb had some commissions coming in but not fast enough. They could cut some things, but the venue was non-negotiable because it set the whole tone. That phrase annoyed me instantly. Set the whole tone. I asked what exactly they wanted from me. Caleb said, help, just help. Jenna said, we're not asking you to pay for the whole wedding. Which is always what people say right before they absolutely ask you to pay for the whole wedding. I went line by line through the budget. I cut nonsense where I could. A champagne wall, custom cocktail stir sticks with their dog's face on them, a late-night pretzel station, monogrammed blankets for guests, a vintage getaway car rental even though neither of them knows how to drive stick. Jenna got tighter and tighter around the mouth every time I crossed something off. Finally she said, I don't want this to feel cheap. And something in me snapped into that old familiar family role. The one where I stop being a person and become a stabilizing structure. I said, how much can you actually afford without pretending? By the end of the conversation, the number was still ugly. Even after cuts, they were short by more than $20,000. Mom looked like she might cry from humiliation. Dad didn't say much, just kept rubbing his knee the way he does when he's uncomfortable. Caleb stared at the table. I had money saved. I'm not rich, but I'm careful. I bought a modest condo at 29, drove the same Honda for 11 years, skipped a lot of dumb financial decisions, and after my engagement ended 2 years earlier, most of the money I had set aside for my own wedding never got spent. I'd left it in savings because I didn't know what else to do with the emotional weirdness of it. So I heard myself say, I'll cover it. Everybody looked up at once. I said, not all the nonsense. Not the stupid extras, but the actual wedding, venue, food, photographer, DJ, florist, basics. I'll pay vendors directly so nobody is playing games with reimbursements. Consider it my gift. Mom burst into tears immediately. Caleb got up so fast his chair scraped the floor and came around the table and hugged me. Like really hugged me, tight, shaking, face in my shoulder. He said, I swear I'll never forget this. Jenna's eyes filled too. She squeezed my hand and said, Melissa, that is unbelievably generous. Seriously, we'll make it so special. That's the problem with moments like that. They make you feel loved right before they make you useful. For the first couple of weeks, it actually felt okay. Caleb called more. Jenna texted me photos of centerpieces and linen swatches and asked for my opinion. Mom kept telling people, vaguely, that family was helping, which was fine with me. I wasn't looking for a parade. I didn't need to be announced on a billboard. I just thought basic gratitude and honesty were enough. I paid the venue deposit first, then the photographer, then the florist. Every bill went directly from me to the vendor, exactly like I said it would. I kept a spreadsheet because of course I did. I made deadlines, confirmed balances, flagged where they were creeping back toward nonsense spending. If they wanted extra upgrades beyond what I'd agreed to, I told them that was on them. That was when Jenna's tone with me started to change. Not openly, nothing you could point to in the moment without sounding petty. Just little things. If I told her the upgraded Chiavari chairs weren't worth another $900, she'd respond, okay, if that's what we have to do. If I asked whether they really needed a custom neon sign with their last name, she'd say, I just want it to feel personal. Every responsible answer from me somehow became me being the bad guy. Caleb would step in with, babe, Mel's just trying to help, in a way that made me sound like an overzealous accountant nobody had invited. Still, I kept going because the money was already committed and I didn't want them to implode over planning. Then came the first conversation that should have made me pull the plug. It was maybe 2 months before the wedding. I was on my lunch break in my car because I had gotten trapped in a 40-minute phone call with the caterer about dietary restrictions and final headcount tiers. Caleb called as soon as I hung up. He sounded overly casual, which is never a good sign. Quick thing, he said. Okay, so Jenna's dad is weird about money. I laughed once. That's not a sentence that has ever ended well for me. No, listen, he's old school. What does that mean? It means he's proud, and he's kind of traditional. I waited. Caleb said, I'd rather he not know you're paying for so much. I just sat there with one hand on the steering wheel, staring at the truck parked in front of me. What? It's not a big thing. It is if you're calling me about it. He rushed ahead. I'm not saying lie, exactly. Really comforting distinction. I'm just saying maybe don't bring it up. If he asks, Mom and Dad are contributing, and we're handling the rest. You are not handling the rest. Melissa. No, say it correctly. You are not handling the rest. There was silence on the line. Then he said, quieter, I don't want people thinking I can't take care of my own wedding. That was the first honest thing he'd said. I leaned my head back against the seat. So you want to take my money but not have anyone know it came from me? That's not fair. It's exactly fair. It's just private. I laughed at that, not because it was funny. Because sometimes the alternative is screaming. Private is not the same thing as erased. He got defensive fast, said I was making it weird, said this was why he hesitated to ask for help in the first place. Said Jenna's family had opinions and he was trying to avoid drama. I told him if the truth about who paid for his wedding created drama, maybe the problem wasn't the truth. He ended the call irritated, and 5 minutes later Mom texted me, please don't make this harder on him than it has to be. That is my mother in one sentence. Everything uncomfortable becomes something I am making harder by noticing it. I should also mention that around this same time, Jenna decided not to ask me to be involved in the wedding party. Which, whatever. I'm 37. I didn't need to stand in a chiffon dress holding a bouquet like an underpaid extra in somebody else's romantic fantasy. But the way it happened was still irritating. She called and said they were keeping it small and balanced, meaning only siblings and close friends. I said, Caleb only has one sibling. Long pause. Then she said, right. But because my brother's standing up there, Caleb asked his friend Trevor to even it out. And honestly, I just think you'll enjoy the day more as a guest. As a guest. That phrase started then. Small, casual, frequent. At first I let it roll off my back. If anything, I thought maybe that was better. Less obligation, less performance. Fine. I bought a navy dress. I booked a hotel room near the venue. I kept paying invoices. I even started planning a separate wedding gift because in my mind, paying for the wedding was a family rescue operation, not something personal from me to them as a couple. And yes, I know that sounds insane, but if you've ever been the fixer in a family, you probably know exactly what I mean. There's the thing you do because everything will collapse if you don't, and then there's the thing you do because you actually want to give something with love. I still wanted that second thing. Caleb and Jenna had been talking for months about buying a house after the wedding. They were renting a nice apartment they absolutely couldn't afford long-term, and every conversation somehow drifted toward how impossible it was to save. So I decided my actual gift to them would be $10,000 toward a down payment. Not cash loose in an envelope like an idiot. I got a cashier's check a week before the wedding and put it in a card I bought from a little stationery store in Clayton. On the front it had one of those watercolor houses with the words for your next chapter. Corny, but sweet. I did not tell a single person. Not Mom, not Dad, not Caleb, not Jenna. It was going to be a surprise. That ended up being one of the only smart things I did. The month before the wedding was when the mask really slipped. Jenna started texting me only when bills were due. No more swatches, no more smiley faces. Just things like the florist says final payment has to be made by Thursday, or can you call the bakery because they're saying the design upgrade costs extra. At one point she sent me a link to ivory parasols for guests in case it was sunny. $480 for decorative umbrellas nobody would ever use again. I responded, that's outside the budget we agreed on. She wrote back, okay. Nothing else. A day later Caleb called and said I didn't have to be so sharp with her. I asked him if he planned on paying for the parasols. He said, "It's not about the parasols. It is always about the parasols. Or the chairs. Or the sign. Or the little meaningless object that tells you whether people still understand the difference between a gift and an open tab." Mom, of course, kept urging peace. "This is such a special time. Jenna is under pressure. You know how your brother gets when he feels judged." Dad mostly stayed out of it, though once when Mom left the room he muttered, if he wanted to be treated like a man, he should have paid for his own damn wedding. That was probably the closest Dad ever came to saying exactly what he thought. The week of the wedding, the total I had spent was just over $23,000. $23,000. Even writing that makes me a little nauseous. The venue was a renovated stone estate outside Defiance, Missouri, with a vineyard on one side and a big reception tent on the other. Jenna wanted everything in creams and dusty green with black accents. Caleb wanted an open bar and a band originally, but we compromised on a DJ and extended bar package. The florist went over budget anyway because Jenna forgot that peonies in May cost what they cost. The photographer was excellent. The cake tasted like almond extract and money. It was beautiful, objectively. I'll give them that. The wedding looked like a magazine spread for people who think their love story is the one that finally cured marriage. The day before the wedding was the rehearsal dinner, which Jenna's parents hosted at a steakhouse in St. Charles. That evening should have warned me how bad the actual wedding day was going to be. I arrived a little late because I'd had to stop by the hotel first, and when I walked in, place cards were already set. There was no seat for me at the main family table. They had me at a side table with two of Jenna's cousins and Caleb's college friend Mark, who spent half the night talking about bourbon and crypto. I found Jenna near the bar and asked, as lightly as I could, "Hey, I think my place card might be at the wrong table." She looked over, then smiled like I was being silly. "No, that's where we put all the non-wedding party siblings and plus ones." I stared at her. "All the what?" She laughed a little. "Melissa, come on. It's just seating. Just seating. That phrase belongs in the same museum as just private and just a guest." I didn't make a scene because I was too tired. Caleb was already half lit on old fashions and kept kissing Jenna's cheek like he was auditioning for a medication commercial. Mom told me to let it go. Dad looked embarrassed on my behalf but also relieved I wasn't pushing it. So I sat at the side table and ate filet mignon with cousin Ashley and some guy who mined Bitcoin. The actual wedding day started at 6:30 in the morning when my phone rang with the venue coordinator's name on the screen. Her name was Tasha, and she had been copied on enough payment emails to know exactly who I was. She sounded panicked. One of the rental deliveries had shown up short on cocktail tables, and the florist was asking who was approving a last-minute greenery add-on. I was still in my hotel robe. I said, "Tasha, I'm not the planner." She hesitated. "I know, but no one else is answering." That says a lot, doesn't it? I got dressed in jeans and drove over there 2 hours before I had planned to. Caleb wasn't picking up. Jenna's bridesmaids were all at hair and makeup. Tasha met me near the side entrance looking like she'd already lived 3 lifetimes that morning. I called Caleb 3 times before he finally answered sounding groggy. "What?" "They're short cocktail tables and the florist is trying to charge extra for additional greenery. Can you just handle it?" I actually closed my eyes. "I am supposed to be getting ready for your wedding. Mel, please. I have like 15 things going on." I almost said, "So do I, including funding your life," but I didn't. I handled it. I approved moving 2 tables from the ceremony lawn to cocktail hour after the vows. I told the florist no on the extra greenery. I tracked down the missing signage boxes because they had somehow ended up with the dessert display. By the time I got back to the hotel, it was after 10 and I had 45 minutes to shower, do my makeup, and put on my dress. When I finally walked into the bridal suite area to say hello, one of Jenna's bridesmaids, Lindsay, I think, looked at me and said, "Oh good, the coordinator's here." Before I could answer, Jenna, in her robe and full face of makeup, laughed and said, "No, that's Caleb's sister. She just can't stop managing things." There were a few giggles. I forced a smile and said, "Only when nobody else is." You know those moments where everybody hears what you actually meant but pretends not to? It was one of those. Jenna tilted her head and said, still smiling, "Well, today you can relax. You're just a guest." There it was again. I said, "Right." Then I left because if I stayed in that room another 10 seconds I was going to say something that would get brought up at Thanksgiving until the sun burned out. The ceremony itself was fine. Beautiful, even if you ignored the acid in my stomach. I was not seated with my parents in the front row. Apparently that row was for immediate family and grandparents, which would have been interesting news to hear if I weren't immediate family. I got put in the second row on the aisle next to my Aunt Marcy, who immediately whispered, "Why are you back here?" I said, "No idea." She squinted toward the front. "That bride's cousin is in your seat." Sure enough, some 20-year-old I'd never met was sitting where I should have been, legs crossed, fanning herself with the program. I said, "It's fine." It was not fine, but I was so deep into swallowing things by then I could have eaten a brick. Caleb looked happy at the altar. I'll give him that too. When Jenna came down the aisle, he teared up. Mom sobbed into a tissue. Dad stood a little straighter. Everybody did the normal emotional wedding stuff. For about 20 minutes I almost convinced myself none of the rest of it mattered. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe weddings just make everybody stupid and brittle and weird. Then came the reception. Cocktail hour was under a white tent strung with warm lights. Everybody kept complimenting what the families had put together. Jenna's mother, Valerie, floated around in a pale gold dress accepting praise like she had personally built the venue with her hands. My mom, to her credit, mostly looked uncomfortable every time someone thanked her for the generosity of the day. At one point a couple I didn't know came up to me because they'd seen me handling an issue with the seating chart easel that kept tilting. The woman said, "You must be the planner. Everything is gorgeous." Before I could answer, Caleb appeared beside me with a whiskey sour in hand and said, laughing, "Nope. She's off duty. She's just a guest today." The woman smiled like it was a cute family joke. I smiled too, because what else was I going to do? Turn to a stranger and say, "Actually, I paid for your chicken marsala?" But that was the moment I knew he wasn't just trying to keep things private. He liked the story better when I was reduced. It made him feel bigger. Still, I kept it together. I found my table, table 14, not with my parents, not with close family, but with two of Dad's cousins and a neighbor from our old street. Again, I let it go because by then I felt like I was moving through water. Slow, heavy, unreal. The dinner started, the salads came out, the band of speeches began. Valerie, the bride's mother, spoke first. She thanked God, the venue, the weather, and everyone whose love and hard work made this day possible. Generic, fine. Then my dad stood and gave a short toast that was actually pretty sweet. He talked about Caleb as a little boy building forts in the living room and Jenna bringing out his steady side, which was generous fiction but kind-hearted. Dad didn't mention the money either, but I hadn't expected him to. Then Caleb took the mic. He started okay, thanked guests for coming, thanked Jenna for choosing him, all that standard wedding toast nonsense. Thanked Jenna's parents for raising such an incredible woman. Thanked our parents for all their support. That last line landed like a slap, because our parents had maybe contributed a few $100s and some emotional weather. But still, I sat there smiling with my wineglass between both hands. Then one of the servers approached my table and leaned down to ask if the late-night snack service should be set out at 9:30 or pushed to 10 because dinner was running behind. Again, because I was the only person all day who had answered a logistical question without blinking. Before I could say she needed to ask the couple, Caleb saw it happen from the sweetheart table. He laughed, lifted the microphone back up, and said, loud enough for the entire tent to hear, "Seriously, can everybody stop asking Melissa stuff? She's not in charge, she's just a guest, like everyone else." People laughed, not cruelly. That almost made it worse. They laughed the way people laugh when they think they're watching harmless sibling banter. A few heads turned toward me. Someone at the next table actually clapped once like, "Okay Melissa, stand down." I don't know if Caleb realized how much of himself he showed in that moment. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but after months of taking my money, hiding it, minimizing it, seating me like a neighbor, using me as unpaid staff all morning, then publicly stripping even the truth of what I'd done down to just a guest, so he could feel like the host of his own life. Something in me went cold. Not hot, not explosive, cold. I smiled. A real one, probably. I even lifted my glass a little, like I was in on the joke. Caleb grinned and went back to his speech. I sat there through the rest of it barely hearing a word. When people started clapping, I stood up, excused myself, and walked to the bathroom. I stayed in there for maybe 5 minutes. Long enough to stare at my own face in the mirror and think, you cannot cry over this. Not here, not for these people. Then I reached into my purse and touched the sealed card. The card I had written 3 nights earlier in my kitchen. For the start of your next chapter, I hope this gives you a little room to breathe and dream. I love you both. Inside it was a cashier's check for $10,000. I looked at myself in the mirror for another second, and all I could think was, if I'm just a guest, then I am under no obligation to leave behind another dollar. So I walked back out. The gift table was near the side entrance, under a sign that said cards and well wishes in Jenna's carefully chosen script font. There was a wooden box with a slot on top and a stack of boxed presents arranged around it. I had slipped my card in there during cocktail hour. I stood there for maybe 3 seconds, listening to the muffled sound of the DJ starting the first dance announcement, and then I lifted the lid on the side of the box. It wasn't locked. Why would it be? This was Missouri, not the crown jewels. I found my envelope in under 10 seconds because my handwriting is distinctive and because I knew exactly which corner I had tucked it into. I took it back out and put it in my purse. That was it. No dramatic flourish, no ripping, no speech, no note, just removal. My Aunt Marcy saw me. Of course she did. Aunt Marcy sees everything. She was walking by with a club soda and stopped dead. Melissa? I looked at her. Her eyes dropped to the envelope in my hand, then back to my face. Marcy has always been one of the only people in my family who can read a room without needing it translated. She didn't ask if I was stealing from the couple or losing my mind or making a mistake. She just said quietly, "Good." I think I laughed a little then, just once. I put the card in my purse, zipped it, and went back inside. I did not leave immediately. That's the part people always expect. But I wasn't interested in creating a scene anybody could turn into a story about my emotions. I sat back down for the first dance. I watched Caleb spin Jenna under the lights while everyone swayed and filmed inside. I drank half a glass of champagne I didn't want. I made polite conversation with Dad's cousin Larry about Cardinals' pitching depth. I stayed through the parent dances and cake cutting because I knew the second I disappeared, Mom would be blowing up my phone and Caleb would become the victim before dessert was served. At around 9:15, after the dance floor opened and people were busy enough not to monitor my movements, I stood up, found my parents near the bar, and told them I was heading out. Mom frowned immediately. Already? I've had a long day. She lowered her voice. You're upset. No kidding. Dad looked from me to her, then said, let her go. Mom started with, Melissa, please don't do anything dramatic. I almost laughed right in her face. I'm literally leaving quietly. That is the least dramatic option available. She looked flustered, as if even my calmness was somehow aggressive. Dad touched my arm and said, very softly, drive safe. I hugged him. I kissed Mom's cheek because despite everything, I am still me, and then I left. The hotel parking lot was cool and dark and smelled faintly like cut grass. I sat in my car with the envelope in my lap for a full minute before turning the key. I expected to feel guilty. I didn't. I felt tired, bone deep, clarifying tired. Back in my room, I took off the dress, washed my face, set the card on the desk, and ordered fries from room service like a divorced businessman in a Marriott. Then I texted my boss that I'd be taking Monday too because I suddenly could not imagine doing spreadsheets for another human being. The first call came the next morning at 8:12. Caleb. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, then answered. He didn't say hello. Did you take your card back? So they had opened gifts early. Or at least checked them. I said, yes. There was silence. Shock more than anything. Then, are you serious? Very. What the hell is wrong with you? I sat on the edge of the hotel bed and looked out the window at a family loading suitcases into a minivan. You really want to do this at 8 in the morning? You stole your own gift back from my wedding. Yes. What kind of person does that? I took a breath. What kind of person takes $23,000 from his sister, spends months pretending she isn't the reason any of this happened, then gets on a microphone and tells a whole room she's just a guest? He immediately went defensive. Oh my God, it was a joke. It wasn't. Yes, it was. No, Caleb, it was the truth as you wanted it told. He started talking over me then, voice rising. Said I was jealous. Said I always had to make everything about me. Said I'd embarrassed him. That part actually made me laugh. Embarrassed you to who? The $10,000 check you didn't get? That shut him up for maybe 2 seconds. Then he said, flatly, what? I was giving you $10,000 toward a house. That was in the card. Separate from the wedding. I took it back. The silence after that was a different kind. Not anger. Calculation. When he finally spoke, he sounded stunned. You're lying. I'm not. Then why would you not tell me? Because it was supposed to be a gift. He exhaled sharply. Jesus Christ. I could practically hear him rerunning the last 12 hours in his head. Every joke, every slight, every seat assignment he hadn't questioned because it benefited him. Then he landed on the easiest emotion available, which was rage. So you punish me at my wedding because your feelings got hurt? No, I decided not to reward you after your behavior made your opinion of me very clear. He called me unbelievable, self-righteous, petty, said Jenna was devastated, said she had defended me for months, which I knew was laughable because Jenna had spent months sanding me down into a payment method with a pulse. I said, if I'm just a guest, then you shouldn't expect guest number 83 to bring you $10,000. He hung up on me. 5 minutes later, Jenna texted, I'm trying really hard to understand why you would do something this cruel. I read that 3 times before answering. Cruel was taking my help and acting ashamed of it. Cruel was treating me like staff until a bill was due and then like an inconvenience when people noticed. She replied almost immediately, you are blowing this so far out of proportion. Caleb's comment was obviously a joke. I wrote back, if it was a joke, why did he spend 6 months making sure nobody knew I paid for the wedding? No answer for 15 minutes. Then, because he was embarrassed, Melissa. Not malicious. There is a difference. That actually made me angrier than if she just insulted me. Embarrassed. There it was, the real thing, finally named. He was embarrassed by me paying. But not embarrassed enough to refuse the money. Just embarrassed enough to erase me once it was spent. I typed, he doesn't get to make his embarrassment my burden. She left me on read. By the time I checked out of the hotel, my mother had called 4 times. I knew what that would be before I answered, and I was right. Melissa, honey, I know you're upset, but this has gotten completely out of hand. I loaded my suitcase into the trunk. Has it? Yes. You shouldn't have taken the card back. He shouldn't have treated me like I was interchangeable. Mom sighed in that tired martyr way she has. He didn't mean it the way you took it. Then how did he mean it? It was just his way of saying you should relax and enjoy the night. After thanking our parents for support they didn't provide? You know what he meant. No, Mom, I know exactly what he meant. She got quiet, then she tried the route she always tries when facts aren't working. This is your brother, and I am his sister. You're older, sometimes you have to be the bigger person. There are few phrases in the English language that make me feel more homicidal than be the bigger person. In my family, it has always meant accept less so someone else can stay comfortable. I said, I have been the bigger person since I was 14. I'm exhausted. Mom started crying then, which she does when she runs out of ways to control a situation. She said I'd tainted the wedding memories. That people were already talking. That Jenna's mother was humiliated. I asked why Valerie would be humiliated by a gift she never knew existed, and Mom didn't answer. Dad called later, separately. His opening line was, "You okay?" That alone almost made me cry harder than anything else had. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good." Then, after a pause, "Your mother wants peace." I laughed without humor. Of course she does. But peace and pretending are not the same thing. That is maybe the wisest sentence my father has ever spoken. He didn't tell me I was right. Dad's not built that way. But he also didn't tell me to apologize. He just said Caleb had been foolish, weddings made people stupid, and maybe some distance wouldn't hurt. Distance turned out to be easy because Caleb made it easy. For the next 2 weeks, he alternated between furious and manipulative. First I was evil, then I was overreacting, then he tried guilt, said the house money would have changed everything for them, said they had already started talking about neighborhoods, said Jenna cried when she realized what had been in the card. I responded once, and only once, "You cried when you lost money." I cried when I realized my brother was willing to publicly shrink me after privately depending on me. After that, I stopped. What made the whole thing almost funny, in a dark way, was how many people started quietly reaching out once the dust settled. Aunt Marcy called me 3 days later and said, "For the record, I would have done worse." My cousin Bree texted, "I need you to know the speech thing was weird and everyone noticed." Even one of Caleb's friends, Trevor, who had been in the wedding party, sent me a message that said, "I don't want to get involved, but I heard from Tasha at the venue that you basically handled half the wedding day. You didn't deserve that." Apparently more people knew than Caleb thought. Vendors knew. People saw me fielding calls. People saw the coordinator looking for me. People saw where I was seated and who got thanked and who didn't. Human beings are not actually that hard to read when they get sloppy. The funniest part was that Jenna's family eventually learned the truth anyway. Not from me, from Tasha, the venue coordinator. About a month after the wedding, Mom called in a state because Valerie had apparently mentioned at brunch that she was impressed by how involved I had been for a mere guest. Mom, already on edge, apparently said something vague like, "Well, Melissa had a lot invested in the day." Valerie asked what that meant, and after enough awkward fumbling, the truth came out in chunks. I didn't hear this directly, obviously, but according to Mom, Valerie was horrified. Not because I'd taken the gift back. Because she and her husband had spent the whole engagement assuming Caleb and Jenna were financially independent except for the rehearsal dinner contribution. They had no idea I had paid for the wedding. None. So all that secrecy Caleb worked so hard to preserve? It blew up anyway. And now, instead of looking private and proud, he looked dishonest and dependent. When Mom told me this, there was a tiny note in her voice that sounded almost like accusation, as if somehow the truth had ambushed them instead of being the inevitable outcome of lying to everyone. I said, "What did he think was going to happen?" Mom said, "He thought it was nobody's business." I said, "Then he shouldn't have made it mine." Caleb did not speak to me for almost 3 months after that. No birthday text, no Thanksgiving invite directly from him, only through Mom. Jenna unfollowed me on Instagram, which honestly was a relief because if I saw one more sepia-toned photo of charcuterie boards and open houses they couldn't afford, I was going to throw my phone into a river. In that silence, I had time to think about all the other little moments in our relationship that I had been filing under not worth fighting about. The rent money when he was 24 and swore he'd pay me back after his commission cleared. The way he'd introduce me to people as, "My sister Melissa, she's basically my second mom," like it was cute instead of revealing. The Christmas he forgot to get me anything but still asked if I could help cover Dad's gift from him. The time he borrowed my car for a weekend and brought it back with an empty tank and a parking ticket. The way gratitude with Caleb was always intense and immediate and strangely short-lived, like a sparkler. Bright for 10 seconds, then smoke. I started realizing the wedding wasn't an isolated act of disrespect. It was the first time the disrespect had a stage, lights, and a microphone. That Christmas was brutal, by the way. Mom insisted the family be together. Dad wanted to keep things normal. Caleb and Jenna showed up 40 minutes late wearing coordinated cream sweaters like they were already curating their holiday card. Jenna hugged Mom. Caleb nodded at me like I was a coworker from another department. We made it through appetizers in relative peace. Then Dad handed Caleb a beer in the kitchen and said, not quietly enough, "You should thank your sister." Caleb went stiff. "For what?" Dad looked at him for a long second. "You know for what." Caleb laughed once, sharp and ugly. "She wants a medal now?" I was in the doorway by then. Mom was behind me whispering, "Please." I said, "No, I don't want a medal. I wanted basic respect." Caleb turned to me. "You held money over my head." I almost couldn't believe he believed that. "I spent $23,000 on your wedding and never once asked for public praise. I asked not to be erased. You took back a gift because of one joke." It was not one joke. He opened his mouth, then shut it, because somewhere deep down he knew it wasn't. He just didn't want to name the rest. Jenna appeared in the kitchen entrance at exactly the wrong moment and said, "Can we not do this again?" Again. Like it was some old mutual conflict instead of one long consequence. Dad surprised all of us by saying, "Then maybe your husband should stop pretending he was wronged." The room went dead quiet. Caleb looked at Dad like he'd been slapped. Dad rarely takes sides. He mostly endures. So when he actually plants a flag, people notice. Caleb muttered, "Unbelievable," grabbed his coat, and he and Jenna left before dessert. Mom cried, naturally. But even she didn't blame me that time. I think, on some level, she was finally too tired to maintain the fiction. It has been a little over a year now. Caleb and I are not no contact, but we are something adjacent to emotionally outsourced strangers. We exchange stiff holiday texts. If mom ends up in the hospital for something minor, we both show up and perform civility in the waiting room like actors in a low-budget family drama. Jenna had a baby shower recently and I sent a gift through the registry but did not attend. I know some people will think that makes me weak or inconsistent. Maybe it does, but there's a difference between refusing to keep being used and declaring someone dead to you. I'm not interested in being dramatic. I'm interested in not getting hurt in the exact same way twice. As for the $10,000, I kept it. Actually, that's not entirely true. About 4 months after the wedding disaster, I put that money toward my own house project. I sold my condo and bought a small brick place in Webster Groves with a cracked patio and the world's saddest kitchen. I used some of the money to redo the cabinets, replace the awful fluorescent ceiling light, and build a deep window seat in the front room where the old radiator used to be. The first morning I sat there with coffee and sunlight on the hardwood floors, I remember thinking this was a much better use of 10 grand than rewarding a man who wanted my money without my presence. Aunt Marcy came over once after the renovation and stood in the kitchen looking around. She said, "So this is what being just a guest gets you?" I laughed so hard I almost snorted coffee. Sometimes the whole story still hits me sideways. Not even the money part, really. The humiliation part. The weird grief of realizing somebody can love what you do for them more than they love you. I think that was the actual wound. Anybody can lose money and recover. It's harder to lose the version of a relationship you thought maybe still had some decency left in it. If I could go back, I obviously wouldn't pay for the wedding. Or I would, but with clear boundaries and the willingness to walk the second those boundaries got stepped on. But the truth is, back then I still believed that if you showed up enough for family, eventually they would stop treating your presence as a utility. I thought repeated generosity built a kind of safety. Instead it built expectation. And yes, before anyone asks, they still tell the story differently depending on the audience. To some people, I'm the bitter older sister who made a scene over a harmless comment. To others, I'm the control freak who couldn't let the couple have their day. To a select few, I'm apparently the cautionary tale about mixing money and family. Fine. They can tell it however they want. I know exactly what happened. My brother asked me to save his wedding, and I did. He let me carry the cost, the logistics, the stress, and the silence. Then, once the room was full and the lights were warm and he finally got to feel like the man at the center of everything, he looked right at the person who made that possible and made sure everybody knew I was just a guest. So I acted like one. And guests are allowed to leave with their own gift. Story 2. My parents gave my inheritance to my sister. Years later, they showed up asking me for a place to stay. My parents showed up on my porch last October with 2 rolling suitcases, a dented blue cooler, and one of those giant plastic storage totes with a cracked lid that had "Winter" written on it in black marker. I opened the door because I thought it was a delivery guy. It was around 7, already dark, and I'd been in the kitchen helping my daughter with a 4th grade project about owls. My wife, Hannah, was upstairs getting our son out of the bath. I had flour on my hands because I was making pizza dough, and for a second I honestly didn't recognize my own father. He looked smaller. That was the first thing that hit me. My dad had always been a broad-shouldered, loud footstep kind of man. Even in his 60s he'd carried himself like he was still the toughest guy on the block. But standing there under the porch light in a windbreaker that was too thin for the weather, shoulders slightly rounded, hair gone almost white, he looked like somebody who'd been sleeping badly for a long time. My mother looked worse, if I'm being honest. Her lipstick was smudged, which for her was the equivalent of showing up half naked. She had on her good camel coat, the one she only wore to church or funerals, and she was clutching the straps of her purse with both hands like she thought I might slam the door. Behind them, parked crooked at the curb, was their old Subaru packed so full I could see blanket rolls and hanging clothes through the back window. I hadn't seen either of them in almost 6 years. My mother gave me this thin, hopeful smile and said, "Hi, Ryan." Not, "How are you?" Not, "Can we talk?" Just my name, soft and careful, like she was testing whether I'd still answer to it if it came from her. I did what people do when their brain needs time to catch up. I looked past them at the car, then at the suitcases, then back at them. My dad cleared his throat. We were in the area. Which was ridiculous, because I live outside Columbus and they were from Erie, and nobody is accidentally in the area with their entire life stuffed into a Subaru. I said, "What are you doing here?" My mother's eyes immediately filled. That was also familiar. She could cry faster than anyone I've ever known, especially when tears might help steer a conversation. "We just need a little time," she said. "A few weeks, maybe. Until we figure some things out." I remember actually laughing. Just once. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes the only thing your body can do with that level of nerve is produce a sound. A few weeks. When I was 25, I found out my parents had given away the inheritance my grandmother left me. Not borrowed, not used temporarily, given away, mostly to my older sister, Amanda, who had spent our entire lives being treated like a walking emergency the rest of us were obligated to solve. And now, years later, after all of that, my parents were standing on my porch asking me for a place to stay because Amanda had finally done to them what they once did to me. The part that still gets me is that they looked surprised when I didn't move aside. I should probably go back, because without the history this just sounds like a guy refusing to help his elderly parents. If you only saw the porch that night, I'd probably look cold. Maybe cruel. My mother definitely thinks so. But this didn't start with 2 suitcases on my front step. It started a long time before that, back when I was a kid and Amanda was the center of gravity in our house and the rest of us just learned to orbit around whatever mood she was in. Amanda is 4 years older than me. She's 39 now. I'm 35. Growing up, she was one of those girls adults described as a lot. Not always in a bad way, at least not out loud, but everybody knew what it meant. She was loud, funny when she wanted to be, pretty in a way that got noticed early, and deeply allergic to hearing the word no. My parents loved that about her. Or maybe they were intimidated by it. I still don't know. If Amanda wanted dance lessons, my parents found room in the budget. If she wanted a new dress because the old one wasn't right for some school thing, they made it happen. If she got caught shoplifting lip gloss at 13, the story somehow became about how the cashier humiliated her. If she failed algebra twice, it was because the teacher had singled her out. If she screamed at my mother and slammed a door hard enough to crack the frame, my father would mutter that she was high-strung and needed understanding. Meanwhile, I was the easy kid, which sounds like a compliment until you realize, easy usually just means the one we knew would get out of the way. I wasn't miserable all the time or anything dramatic like that. We weren't one of those nightmare households where people were throwing plates. My parents fed us, kept the lights on, went to school concerts, took us to the lake in the summer. On the outside we looked pretty normal. But inside the family, the rules were never really the same. Amanda got explanations. I got expectations. She got second chances before the first consequences even landed. I got told to be mature. She got, "That's just how Amanda is." I got, "Don't make things harder than they need to be." My grandmother noticed. Her name was Lorraine, but everybody called her Lori except me. I called her Nana because I was apparently born 80 years old. She was my dad's mother, and she lived alone in a little brick ranch house on the west side of Erie with green shutters, a chain-link fence, and one of those aluminum awnings that made rain sound like applause. It always smelled like coffee, ivory soap, and whatever soup she'd made that week. Nana was not a warm and fuzzy grandmother in the Hallmark sense. She wasn't baking pies in aprons or slipping me $20 bills behind my parents' backs. She was more like, observant, quiet, sharp in a way that made you sit straighter without knowing why. Amanda found her boring because Nana didn't gush over her. I loved being there because it was the one house where I didn't feel like background noise. Nana would ask me questions and actually wait for the answers. What book was I reading? How was drafting class? Did I still want to build houses someday? I'd sit at her kitchen table with a grilled cheese while she balanced her checkbook in this little blue ledger. And she'd tell me stories about my grandfather fixing radios in the garage or the winter my dad broke his arm sledding and cried the whole drive to the hospital but swore everyone it didn't hurt. When I was 15, Nana got sick. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and ugly. By the time anybody outside the immediate family knew how bad it was, she'd already stopped doing chemo because, as she put it, She had no interest in spending the end of her life throwing up into a plastic bucket to maybe buy herself 6 more miserable months. She died 3 weeks after my 16th birthday. The funeral was small, gray, and freezing. Typical Erie in February. The wind off the lake felt like punishment. Amanda wore heels and complained the cemetery path was muddy. My mother cried theatrically into a tissue she barely got wet. My dad actually cried for real, which I'd only seen once before. I cried too, harder than I expected. Not loud, just steady and humiliatingly unstoppable. Nana had been the only person in my family who made me feel seen without demanding anything from me in return. A week after the funeral, my parents sat Amanda and me down at the dining room table and told us Nana had left us money. I still remember the pattern on the tablecloth because I stared at it the whole time. Little faded blue flowers. My dad said Nana's house would be sold, and some other accounts she had would be settled, and in the end she'd left an equal inheritance for both of us. Not a fortune, but enough to help. College, a first house, a start in life, as he put it. Amanda immediately asked how much. My mother gave her this chastising look that wasn't real because everyone in that room knew she was wondering the same thing. Dad said it would end up being a little over $90,000 each, maybe more depending on the sale of the house and fees. There was a trust arrangement because I was still a minor and Amanda, even though she was 20, was apparently terrible with money even then. The money would be managed until each of us turned 25. Amanda asked if she could get some early for tuition. Dad said there was some flexibility. That phrase mattered more than I understood at 16. After that, life just kept moving the way it does even after something huge happens. Amanda bounced between majors at Mercyhurst for another year, then dropped out. She moved back home. Then she met Tyler, who was 26, sold used cars, wore too much cologne, and said, "Brother," to everyone including women. My parents hated him for about a month. Then Amanda announced she was pregnant, and suddenly Tyler became rough around the edges but devoted. She lost the pregnancy at 10 weeks. It was awful, genuinely. I'm not trying to downplay that. But that was also the period where Amanda learned, maybe permanently, that pain gave her leverage in our family. Everything after that was handled as though she might shatter if anybody denied her anything. By the time I graduated high school, Amanda and Tyler were engaged. Their wedding was set for the following spring at this rustic event barn outside town with string lights and mason jars and all the stuff that was trendy then. My mother talked about centerpiece options like it was a state function. My dad took extra shifts at the office. Amanda cried over peony prices and chair covers and whether the bridesmaids' dresses were dusty rose enough. I was 18 and trying to figure out how to pay for Columbus State and maybe eventually transfer somewhere bigger for construction management. I worked at a hardware store after school and on weekends. I had okay grades, not spectacular, but solid. I'd asked my parents more than once what the plan was for college money, and every time I got some version of, "We're working things out," or, Nana wanted to help all of us, or, "Let's get through the wedding first." That should have been a clue. The summer after graduation, I sat down with my parents at the kitchen table with a notebook full of tuition numbers, apartment estimates, and what I'd saved from work. I remember being nervous, but also kind of hopeful. I wasn't asking to go to some expensive private school. I had a practical plan. Community college first, keep working, maybe live at home the first year. My mother barely looked at the notebook. She said, "Your father and I think the smartest thing is for you to start local and pay as you go as much as possible. You don't want debt hanging over your head." I said, "Okay, but what about Nana's money?" The silence after that felt wrong immediately. Dad rubbed his chin and said, "That money isn't just sitting there for whatever. There are rules." I said, "You told us it was for college or a house or getting started." "It is," my mother said too quickly. "But it has to be managed carefully." Then Amanda came in, grabbed a Diet Coke, heard the word, money, and somehow ended up in the conversation like she had every right to be there. She leaned against the counter and said, "Can we not do this like I'm draining the family?" Jesus. I hadn't even mentioned her. That was another clue. I ended up going to Columbus anyway, but not the version I'd imagined. I lived in a basement apartment with 2 guys I knew from high school and worked nights unloading trucks at a Home Depot distribution center. During the day I took classes and tried not to fall asleep in them. I ate a lot of peanut butter sandwiches and those microwave burritos that always burn one end and stay frozen in the middle. I called home less and less because every conversation somehow turned into Amanda. Amanda needed help with rent because Tyler's commissions were down. Amanda was stressed. Amanda had lost another pregnancy. Amanda was thinking about opening a salon suite. Amanda deserved something nice after everything she'd been through. When I did ask about the inheritance, my mother would get irritated and say things like, "You have such a transactional way of looking at family lately," which is a hell of a thing to say to the one person in the family who kept being told to expect less. The wedding happened. It was huge, bigger than anything my parents could realistically afford. Open bar, a photographer from Cleveland, limo bus. My mother cried because it was magical. My father looked like a man silently calculating interest rates. Amanda floated around in white lace like she'd personally invented love. I stood next to the groomsmen in a rented gray suit that didn't fit right and watched my sister spend money that absolutely, 100%, was not all coming from my parents' checking account. That was the first time I knew. Not suspected, knew. You can tell when a lie has structure around it. Suddenly every vague answer, every dodged question, every later, and not now, snapped into place. After the wedding I asked my dad straight out, just the two of us in his garage while he was pretending to sort extension cords. "Did you use my inheritance for Amanda?" He kept his back to me for a long time. Then he said, "That's not a fair way to put it." Which is basically yes in family language. I said, "So that's what happened." He turned around then, looking annoyed, not ashamed. "Some funds were advanced for family needs. You act like we robbed a bank. Was it my money?" He sighed. "Ryan, you've always been the one who can make it work." Amanda needed more support. That sentence did something to me I don't think I fully understood until years later. Not the money part, the ranking part. You're the one who can make it work. Meaning, you can survive being wronged, so we're comfortable wronging you. I wish I could say I exploded, but I didn't. I just stood there feeling cold all over, even though it was July and the garage smelled like hot rubber and grass clippings. I said, "How much?" Dad said, "It's complicated." Which meant a lot. By then I was already used to surviving. I transferred into an electrical apprenticeship program because I couldn't keep doing school and nights and pretending I wasn't drowning. It ended up being one of the best decisions of my life, but at the time it felt like settling. I was 20, exhausted, and quietly furious all the time. I stopped asking for anything. That's probably what my parents wanted. Amanda had 2 kids in quick succession, Ellie and Mason. Tyler cheated on her at least twice that anyone knew about, maybe more. She left him, went back, left again. Every crisis came with the same expectation. Everyone rally, everyone contribute, everyone understand. I sent birthday gifts for the kids. I showed up for Christmas sometimes. I kept things polite because cutting off your family in your early 20s feels dramatic and impossible even when they've earned it. Then I turned 25. I'd spent years hanging on to this private, stupid hope that whatever had been advanced to Amanda, there would still be something left for me. Maybe not 90,000, maybe half, enough for a down payment, enough to stop feeling like I started adult life 3 laps behind everyone else. I was dating Hannah by then. She was working as a dental hygienist, practical and funny and incapable of being manipulated by tears, which was one of the first things I loved about her. We were renting a narrow townhouse in Hilliard with beige carpet and terrible insulation, and I'd started looking at starter homes online at night. Nothing fancy. A 2-bedroom ranch, maybe. Something with a yard big enough for a grill. When my birthday came and went without a word from my parents about the trust, Hannah asked, very gently, "Have you ever actually seen paperwork?" That embarrassed me more than it should have. So I called the attorney's office that had handled Nana's estate. The original attorney had retired, but another lawyer there pulled the file and called me back 2 days later. I was in my work van in a Menards parking lot when she told me. The trust was exhausted, not low, not reduced, exhausted, closed 3 years earlier. For a second I honestly thought she had the wrong person. I said, "No, that can't be right. There should be an individual share for me." There was a pause, paper shuffling. Then she said, carefully, "There was. I'm looking at disbursement records now." I asked her to email everything she legally could. I sat in that van for almost an hour after the call ended, just staring through the windshield at shopping carts and people loading mulch bags into their trunks. When the records came through, I printed them at Staples because I couldn't bear to read them on my phone. Some of the withdrawals were old enough and vaguely labeled enough that I couldn't trace them exactly. Educational expenses, health and welfare, housing support, family stabilization. I'm not kidding. Family stabilization, like Amanda, was a failed nation state. But some of it was obvious. A payment to Mercyhurst the semester after she asked for early access. A large withdrawal right before her wedding. Another the year she and Tyler bought a condo they absolutely could not afford on their own. A chunk that went toward legal fees during her divorce. And mixed through all of it, smaller withdrawals that were probably justified under household expenses, while she and her kids were living with my parents. My share, my name on the account, my grandmother's money, drained into the black hole of Amanda's life, one emergency at a time, while I worked double shifts and ate ramen and wondered why I was always being told to be patient. There was a letter too, a scanned copy from the estate file, something Nana had written to be included with the trust documents. It was short, 2 paragraphs. She wrote that she wanted both her grandchildren to have a fair beginning in adult life, and that the money should be used equally, each according to their own needs and plans, but never in a way that favored one child over the other. She underlined equally. I still have that copy in a folder in my desk. I went to my parents' house that Sunday with the records in a manila envelope. Amanda was there, of course. She always was when there was any chance the conversation might involve resources. The whole thing happened in their kitchen. Same table, same faded blue flower tablecloth, though by then it had a burn mark near the edge. My mother made coffee like we were having a normal visit. My father had that defensive stiffness in his jaw. Amanda sat with one ankle over her knee, scrolling her phone, looking bored. I laid the paperwork on the table. My mother's face changed immediately. Not to guilt, to irritation at being cornered. I said, "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." Dad didn't even pick up the papers. "Ryan, no, tell me I'm wrong." Amanda finally looked up. "Can we not do this in front of the kids?" Her children were in the living room watching cartoons with the volume too loud, which meant she had, as usual, brought them as emotional shields. I said, "You've been spending my money for years." My mother said, "That is such a nasty way to phrase this." I actually remember my own voice being weirdly calm. That's when I'm the angriest, usually. "What's the nice way to phrase it?" Dad said, "Your sister was in serious situations. We made decisions as parents. With my inheritance. With family money," my mother snapped. "Money that came from your grandmother, for this family." I pulled out the letter. "It says equal." She underlined it. Amanda rolled her eyes and said, "Oh my God, Ryan, I can't believe you're doing this over dead grandma money." That was the moment I looked at her and realized there was truly no bottom to her entitlement. None. We were speaking completely different moral languages. I said, "You spent almost all of it." She laughed, this sharp disbelieving laugh. "Spent? You mean survived?" "Sorry, my life wasn't as easy as yours." "Easy. I was working 50-hour weeks and driving a van with no air conditioning while she lived in my parents' house rent-free with a fresh manicure." I looked at my father. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" He rubbed his forehead. "We figured when you were more settled, we could work something out." "With what money?" Silence. My mother said, "You were never supposed to struggle the way you insist on pretending. You chose your own path." I still don't fully know what she meant by that, unless your own path meant not making myself a permanent dependent. I asked, "How much is left?" Dad said quietly, "Nothing. There's a certain kind of betrayal that doesn't feel hot. It feels hollow, like somebody scooped something out of you and left the shell standing." I said, "You stole from me." My mother stood up so fast her chair scraped. "How dare you?" Amanda stood too, because if my mother got dramatic, Amanda had to match it. "Don't call them thieves. They've done everything for everyone." I said, "Exactly." That set her off. She started crying instantly, talking about miscarriages and Tyler and how nobody understood what she'd dealt with and how I'd always resented her because she was more emotional and needed more. My mother went to put an arm around her. My father looked tired but not sorry. Not one of them apologized. That matters. If my parents had sat there and said, "We panicked. We made terrible choices. We were wrong. We'll spend the next 10 years making this right however we can," I honestly don't know what I would have done. maybe things would have gone differently. But that isn't what happened. What happened was they justified it. Amanda claimed it, my mother weaponized tears, my father called it complicated. And somehow I was the one making a scene. I left with the letter and the records and a kind of clarity I'd never had before. I didn't sue. People always ask that whenever I've told a condensed version of this story. The answer is, I thought about it. Briefly, I even talked to a lawyer. But the trust language gave the trustee broad discretion, and while I might have had a case, it would have cost money I didn't have and probably dragged on forever. My parents had paper cover for enough of it that it would have become one more exhausting fight where I bled resources and they cried about family. So instead, I did the thing that hurt them most and healed me best. I disappeared, not literally, they knew I was alive. But I stopped participating in the version of family where I existed mainly as backup funding with feelings nobody had to honor. I blocked Amanda everywhere after she sent me a 4-paragraph text about how I was punishing a mother of 2 over accounting issues. I stopped going home for holidays. When my mother mailed me a Christmas card with a handwritten note pretending everything was normal, I threw it away unopened. When Dad left a voicemail saying, "Let's not drag this out," I deleted it. Hannah never pressured me either way. She just listened. One night, not long after the confrontation, we were sitting on the floor of our rental eating takeout because the kitchen table was covered in paint swatches, and I said, "I think if I keep trying with them, I'm basically agreeing with what they did." She nodded and said, "Then stop trying." It sounds simple, but I needed somebody outside my family system to say it like it was allowed. We got married when I was 27. Small ceremony at a park lodge. My friend Marcus grilled burgers after. Hannah wore a simple dress and laughed through the whole thing because the flower girl, my niece from her side, kept trying to eat the petals out of her basket. It rained for 10 minutes right before the ceremony and then stopped. We spent maybe a tenth of what Amanda spent on chair sashes alone, and it was one of the happiest days of my life. My parents were invited. They didn't come. My mother mailed a gift card and a note saying she was heartbroken things had become so divided. No mention of why. Amanda didn't acknowledge it at all. A year later Hannah and I bought a small fixer-upper on the east side of Columbus. Pale yellow siding, crooked gutters, ancient water heater, but good bones. I walked through it the first time and saw what it could be. We spent weekends pulling up carpet, painting cabinets, replacing light fixtures. I learned more doing that house than I had in some of my classes. The down payment came from our savings. My savings. Hannah's savings. No inheritance, no family help, no safety net. That mattered to me maybe more than it should have. Sometimes when I was sanding trim late at night with a podcast in my ears, I'd imagine what life would have looked like if I'd had even half of what Nana intended for me. Less debt, more choices, earlier start, maybe a different career path. Then I'd get angry all over again. But over time the anger changed shape. It got less sharp, less daily. More like scar tissue than an open wound. We had our daughter, June, when I was 30. Our son, Caleb, 2 years later. Life got loud and expensive and ordinary in the best possible way. Soccer practice, daycare coughs, grocery bills that felt like legal theft. Saturdays at Home Depot because one thing in the house always needed fixing. Hannah switched to part-time when the kids were small. I started my own electrical contracting business with a partner from the Union Hall. We worked our asses off. We did okay. And because apparently irony loves me specifically, I got good at the exact thing my parents always assumed I'd just make work. We moved to a bigger house 3 years ago. Nothing fancy, but enough room for the kids to stop sharing. White siding, black shutters, a maple tree out front, and a finished basement where June does art projects and Caleb builds Lego cities that I'm not allowed to disturb. There's a small guest room on the first floor that we mostly use for storage and the occasional visiting friend. That room is what my parents came for. I didn't know all of that while I was standing on the porch, obviously. At that moment I just knew they looked tired, had luggage, and expected something from me they had not earned. My mother said, "Can we come in? It's cold." Hannah had come halfway down the stairs by then. She looked from me to them and instantly understood enough not to smile. I stepped aside because I'm not a monster, and because I didn't want my neighbors watching my elderly parents get turned away on the porch before I even knew the story. They came in carrying that stale car smell and cold October air with them. My father set the suitcases just inside the entryway but kept one hand on the handle, like he wasn't sure if he'd be told to take them back out. My mother glanced around the house the way people do when they're taking inventory of your life. She noticed the hardwood floors first, then the framed school pictures, then the kitchen renovation Hannah and I did last spring. Her eyes landed on the built-in bench by the window where June keeps her backpacks and Caleb throws his shoes. I know that look. It was part appraisal, part surprise, part something that might have been resentment. Hannah said hello politely and asked if they wanted coffee. My mother said yes in a voice that suggested coffee was a tiny kindness, confirming the larger one she expected. Dad said no. We sat at the kitchen table, which is where so much damage in my family seems to happen. June and Caleb were upstairs by then because Hannah told them Grandma and Grandpa were visiting, and they reacted the way kids do to people who are technically relatives but functionally strangers. Curious, but wary, I asked, what happened? My parents exchanged the kind of look couples have when they've already had the same argument 50 times in private and now have to perform unity in public. Dad answered first. We sold the house. I said, okay. Mom jumped in. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. That is, in my experience, the slogan of every bad decision my family has ever made. They'd refinanced the house 2 years earlier, supposedly to consolidate debt and help with repairs. Then there was something about Amanda's bakery venture. Yes, bakery. Because every woman who watches 3 seasons of a baking competition apparently thinks she can run a small business. Amanda had gotten remarried briefly to a guy named Scott who invested in concepts and wore loafers without socks. That marriage lasted 11 months. But before it imploded, he and Amanda convinced my parents to take out a home equity loan to help launch a boutique cupcake and dessert shop in a suburban strip mall. Amanda had done custom cookie orders out of my parents' kitchen for a while, and my mother, predictably, said everyone loved them. Therefore, bakery. You can already see where this is going. The shop lasted less than a year. Bad lease, bad management, inconsistent hours, too much money spent on decor, not enough on payroll. Scott vanished when the bills got real. Amanda blamed stress and migraines and sabotage from a neighboring coffee shop. My parents covered shortfalls. Then Amanda moved back in with them again, with her teenage son for a while, though Ellie had already gone off to college. At some point, and I still don't have every detail, my parents had signed things for Amanda they shouldn't have signed. Co-signed debt, maybe. Shifted balances. Paid tax issues. The result was that the house I grew up in, the one my father had spent 30 years paying off, got sold under pressure before foreclosure or legal action got worse. After the sale, they'd rented a smaller apartment. Amanda was supposed to come too, temporarily, but apparently temporary is genetic in my family. She stayed, brought chaos, fought with the landlord, and then left for North Carolina with some guy named Benji who does logistics. My mother said it like that was a respected profession and not an obvious euphemism for whatever sketchy thing Benji actually does. Once Amanda left, my parents were still on the hook for everything she detonated behind her. The apartment was too expensive. Dad's health wasn't great. Mom had retired earlier than planned. Their savings were basically gone. I listened to all of this with this bizarre detached feeling, like watching a movie you already know the ending to. Finally I said, so why are you here? My mother looked offended by the question. Because you're our son. I said, no. Why are you here instead of with Amanda? That landed. Dad looked down at his hands. Mom went stiff. Then she said, after a beat too long, Amanda's place isn't suitable. I said, is Amanda even in North Carolina? More silence. Dad said quietly, we don't know exactly where she is right now. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at them. Hannah brought coffee over, set the mugs down, and sat beside me without saying anything. Which I appreciated, because there was no way to make this less absurd. My mother tried a different angle. Ryan, whatever happened before, we are in a difficult position. We thought maybe we could stay here for a little while. Just until after the holidays. We'd help out, of course. Help out. Like they were proposing a charming multi-generational arrangement, not arriving as human consequences. I said, you haven't spoken to me in 6 years. That isn't true, my mother said immediately. You sent Christmas cards. We didn't know how to fix things when you shut us out. I almost laughed again. Shut us out. As if I'd slammed some perfectly good relationship over a misunderstanding instead of stepping away from people who stole from me and defended it. Dad finally said, "We know we made mistakes." It was the closest thing to accountability I'd heard from either of them in years, and even then it came out like he was reading words off fogged glass. I asked, "Which mistakes?" He looked at me, then away. "A lot of them. Not good enough." My mother's eyes started watering again. "Do we have to dissect the past tonight? We are exhausted." And there it was. The family rule. The person in immediate discomfort gets priority. History can wait. Damage can wait. Accountability can wait. The fire in front of us matters more than the arson behind it. For a second, I was 16 again, being asked to move aside because Amanda needed more. Then Hannah put her hand lightly on my arm under the table, and I was back in my own house. I said, "No, just that, calm, clear." My mother blinked. "No, you can't stay here." She stared at me like I'd slapped her. Dad's face fell, but he didn't argue yet. I think some part of him knew. Mom said, "Ryan, please. We are not asking for forever." I said, "I know exactly what temporary means in this family." She started crying for real then, shoulders shaking, mascara threatening. Old me would have rushed to soothe. New me sat still. Dad said, quietly but with an edge, "You would really turn us away." I looked at him and said, "You turned me away a long time ago. You just did it while I was young enough that you thought I'd call it love." Hannah squeezed my arm hard enough to say she was with me. My mother said, "That's cruel." I said, "Cruel was taking the money Nana left me and deciding I'd be fine without it." Dad rubbed both hands over his face. "We're not saying that was right. Then say it clearly." He didn't. My mother said, "Amanda needed help." I said, "And I didn't matter." "That's not what I said. It's what you did." The thing about a lot of family conflicts is that people will claim the meaning of their intentions matters more than the evidence of their actions. My parents never said, "Ryan matters less." They didn't need to. They demonstrated it for years. My mother kept crying softly into a tissue Hannah handed her because Hannah is a better person than I am. Dad looked around the kitchen like maybe the walls would tell him what to do. After a while, he said, "What do you want us to say?" I said, "The truth." He was quiet long enough that the refrigerator motor kicked on and off again. Then he said, in a voice I almost missed, "We thought you'd recover easier." There it was. Not remorse. Strategy. Not we believed Amanda deserved it more, though that was implied. More like, we assessed which child would absorb the hit better. I nodded once. "Yeah, I know." My mother whispered, "We were trying to keep the family together." I said, "No. You were keeping Amanda comfortable. There's a difference." At some point June came halfway down the stairs and whispered, "Dad?" Because kids can feel tension like static. Hannah went to her, took her back up, and turned on a movie in our room. I could hear Caleb asking too loudly if Grandpa was sleeping over. My mother definitely heard that too. She looked up at me and said, "You have room." It's amazing how quickly grief can become entitlement. "Yes," I said, "I do." She actually seemed shocked that I wasn't embarrassed by that. Like having space morally obligated me to hand it over. Dad's tone changed then, harder. "So that's it? Because you're still mad about money from years ago?" I said, "No, I'm not still mad about money. I know exactly who you are because of what you did, and because you never thought you owed me the truth, let alone an apology." "We apologized," my mother said. I looked right at her. "No, you didn't. What they had done, over and over, was express sadness that I had feelings about it. That is not the same thing." We sat there a long time. Finally Hannah came back down and asked me, very quietly, if I wanted her to take the kids to her sister's for the night. I said no. I didn't want this spilling wider than it already had. So I made a compromise I could live with. I told my parents they could not stay in my house, but I would pay for a week at the extended stay hotel off the highway and help them look at short-term rentals, senior apartments, whatever programs might make sense. I'd help with logistics. I'd even drive them there that night if they wanted. But they were not moving into my home. My mother looked at me like I'd offered her a park bench. Dad said, "We can't afford that kind of place long-term." I said, "I didn't say a long-term. I said a week." Mom said, "You'd rather put us in a hotel than open your home." I answered honestly, "Yes." That honesty seemed to offend her more than anything else. She said, "I can't believe this is the man you became." And that one almost got me, because there's still some kid in me that wants my mother to think well of me even after everything. But then Hannah said, before I could, he became a man who protects his family. Silence. My father looked at Hannah then in a way I didn't like, not angry exactly, but measuring. Like maybe he'd been assuming this whole time that she was the obstacle, the wife whispering against reconciliation. As if I couldn't possibly have boundaries on my own. He said, this should be between us. Hannah said, calm as anything, it is between you. But this is also my house and my children. He didn't have much to say after that. I booked the hotel from my phone while they sat there. 1 room, 2 beds, kitchenette, 7 nights. I paid up front. My mother cried again, but this time it was quieter, more resentful than wounded. Dad thanked me once, clipped and formal, like he was accepting a business favor from someone he didn't like. When we loaded their stuff back into the Subaru, the street was dark and the porch light made everything look flatter than it was. My mother moved slowly, dramatic without being theatrical about it. Dad kept wincing when he bent, which was the first hint I got that his health issues might be more real than the vague references suggested. Before getting into the car, he turned to me and said, I hope when your kids are older, they don't keep score the way you do. I said, I hope when my kids are older, I never give them a reason to. He got in the car after that. My mother rolled down the window once they were both seated. You'll regret this, she said. I didn't answer. They drove off toward the hotel, tail lights disappearing at the end of the street, and I stood there long enough that the cold finally forced me back inside. Hannah locked the door behind me. That should have been the end of it, but family stories rarely end cleanly. Over the next week I got more of the missing details, partly from my parents, mostly from other people who couldn't resist participating once there was drama to feed on. My Aunt Denise called first. She's my mother's younger sister and has the uncanny ability to sound sympathetic while actively gathering ammunition. She opened with, I don't want to get involved, which is how you know someone is deeply involved already. Apparently my mother had called half the family from the hotel and told them I'd refused them shelter. No mention of the inheritance. No mention of 6 years of silence. No mention of the fact that I paid for the hotel. Just me, heartless son, leaving aging parents adrift. I let Denise talk for a while, then I said, did Mom mention Nana's trust? Silence. Then, what trust? So I told her, not every dollar, not every document, just enough. By the end of the call Denise had gone from righteous to uncomfortable. She said, well, I didn't know all that. Which is family code for I wish I hadn't called because now my outrage needs editing. A cousin texted me later saying he'd heard there was old money stuff involved, and suddenly the pressure on me eased. Funny how the moral urgency of helping family drops once people realize money was stolen on the front end. My parents, meanwhile, spent the hotel week oscillating between asking for practical help and trying to renegotiate the original answer. Dad asked if I knew a decent used car appraiser because they were thinking of selling the Subaru. I sent him a number. Mom asked if I could come look at an apartment listing because she didn't trust online scams. I did. Then, during that same apartment visit, she stood in the empty living room of a tired complex with beige walls and said, it's just hard not to think how much easier all of this would be if you'd let us come to the house for a little while. As if the appeal to guilt was a natural extension of my driving her there. I said, we're not reopening that. She sighed heavily. I just don't know why you want to punish us. I remembered turning and looking at her in that empty apartment, with fake wood floors and a smell like old paint, and thinking how little she still understood me. I said. If I wanted to punish you, I'd do nothing. I'm helping you. I'm just not sacrificing my peace to do it. She started crying again, but softer this time. More tired than manipulative. That was the first moment I saw her as something other than my mother or my antagonist. Just a woman who had spent decades arranging reality around one child and had finally run out of room to do it. She said, you have no idea what it's like to be a parent and choose between your children. I almost laughed at the absurdity of that sentence coming from her, but I didn't. Instead I said, that's the thing, Mom. You never thought you were choosing. That's why we're here. She didn't answer. Dad and I had one real conversation during that week. We were standing outside the hotel while he smoked a cigarette he clearly wasn't supposed to be smoking, given the inhaler in his jacket pocket. It was windy, and somebody nearby was grilling something cheap that smelled weirdly good. He said, without looking at me, The first time we took money out, it really was for tuition. Your sister said she'd pay it back. I said nothing. He took another drag. Then the wedding got bigger than planned. Then Tyler left. Then the kids. It was always something. That's kind of my point. He nodded once like he knew that. After a minute he said, your mother kept thinking if Amanda could just get one clean break, everything would settle. And you? He shrugged. I got tired. That, more than anything else, felt honest. Not noble, not forgivable, but honest. He said, I knew it was wrong by the condo. Maybe before, but by then we were already in too deep. I looked at him and said, you could have told me. He stared out at the parking lot. Probably. I asked, did you ever plan to pay me back? He was quiet long enough that I had my answer before he gave it. We thought there'd be time. Meaning no. There's a weird grief in hearing the plain version of a lie you already survived. It doesn't hurt in a new way. It just confirms that the wound was exactly what you thought it was. I said, there isn't. He nodded. That was the closest we ever came to a real reckoning. By the end of the week, I'd helped them secure a small senior apartment in Delaware, north of Columbus. 1 bedroom, subsidized, nothing special, but clean and manageable. I paid the application fee and the deposit because despite everything, I wasn't going to pretend I wanted them homeless. I also told myself, truthfully, that paying a few $100 to place firm distance between us was cheaper than letting them into my house and spending the next year entangling that disaster. When I told my mother I'd cover the deposit but not the monthly rent after that, she said, you really know how to make help feel conditional. I said, that's because it is. I moved a love seat for them the first weekend. Dad's back was in bad shape, so it was mostly me and a neighbor kid they'd hired for $50. My mother unpacked kitchen things in that fussy, brittle way she has when she's unhappy with the size of the room, the color of the walls, the reality of her own life. At one point she held up a chipped serving bowl and said, one never thought I'd end up like this. I almost said, neither did I, back when you were spending my inheritance. But I didn't. I was too tired. The apartment was so small that the two of them had to squeeze past each other in the galley kitchen. Their bedroom faced the parking lot. There was a little balcony barely deep enough for 2 chairs. My mother hated it on sight. Dad sat down on the love seat once we got it inside and just stayed there, elbows on knees, breathing hard. He looked older than he had on my porch. Older than I think he'd let himself be until there was no house left to defend it from. Before I left, he said, thank you. I believed him that time. My mother hugged me without asking and whispered, I still think you could have done more. That was the moment any last doubt I had finally died. Because if I'd emptied my guest room, fed them, driven them to appointments, let their grief and chaos and old patterns soak into my marriage and my children's home, she still would have found a way to frame it as less than she deserved. Some people can receive help only by converting it into evidence that more was owed. I stepped back and said, take care of yourself, Mom. Then I left. That was 8 months ago. Since then, contact has settled into something thin and strange. Dad texts me occasionally, usually practical things. The name of a cardiologist. A question about replacing an outlet. Once, a photo of a walleye he caught at Alum Creek with a caption that just said, still got it. I responded with a thumbs up. It's not warmth, exactly, but it's not nothing. My mother calls more than I answer. When I do answer, she wants to talk around the past, never through it. She'll ask about the kids, comment on the weather, mention a woman in her building who makes terrible tuna casserole, then drift into little barbed remarks about how family used to be closer, or how aging teaches you who's really there for you. I've gotten better at ending those calls quickly. Amanda, for the record, surfaced in Florida after North Carolina and then apparently somewhere outside Tampa. I know this because Ellie found Hannah on Facebook and messaged her last winter. Not Amanda, my niece. Ellie's 20 now. Smart kid, always was. She wrote this long, awkward message apologizing for all the family mess and saying she'd only recently learned about the inheritance. She said her mother had always described me as selfish and bitter, and it took her growing up to realize selfish people usually don't spend years quietly paying for everyone else's choices. I cried reading that, which surprised me. Not because I needed vindication from a 20-year-old, but because it was the first time anybody from that side of the family had looked at the whole picture and named it accurately. Ellie and I got coffee a month later when she was in Columbus visiting a friend. She looks a lot like Amanda around the eyes, which was disorienting, but she has none of her mother's gravitational hunger. She asked me questions nobody in my family had ever asked. What I remembered about Nana. What actually happened with the trust. Whether I hated Amanda. I told her the truth. I don't think I hate her anymore. Hate requires a kind of heat I don't have left for her. What I feel is closer to recognition. Amanda is exactly who my parents trained her to be. A person who believes love is proven by rescue and that other people's resources naturally belong to her if she wants them badly enough. That doesn't excuse her, but it does explain the shape of the damage. Ellie said, "Grandma and Grandpa still think Mom's going to fix things." I said, "I think your grandparents have been thinking that for 20 years. She laughed, but it was sad. Sometimes I wonder what Nana would say if she knew where everything ended up. Her money gone. Her son old and tired in a subsidized apartment. My mother still unable to say the word sorry without stapling an excuse to it. Amanda drifting from one man and one mess to the next. Me standing in a kitchen I paid for myself, teaching my daughter fractions with pizza slices while my parents wait outside asking for the guest room. I used to think the inheritance was the story. The missing money, the unfairness, the practical loss, and it was a huge part of it, obviously. That money would have changed my 20s. It would have changed what kind of stress Hannah and I carried early on. It would have changed timelines, maybe opportunities. But as I've gotten older, I've realized the money wasn't the deepest cut. The deepest cut was being studied by the people who were supposed to protect me and being judged the safer sacrifice. That's what I heard in my father's voice all those years ago in the garage. You're the one who can make it work. The porch last October was just the final echo of that. They still thought I'd absorb it. The inconvenience, the discomfort, the old family arrangement. They still believed, somewhere under the panic, that if they came to my door tired enough and sad enough, I would step aside and let their problem become my problem because that had always been my role. And the reason I said no wasn't because I wanted revenge. It was because I finally understood that if I said yes, even for a week, I'd be teaching my own children the same lesson I spent half my life unlearning. That love means surrendering your place in the room. That being dependable means being available for exploitation. That family history gives people a permanent key to your boundaries. I won't teach them that. The night my parents left for the hotel, after the taillights disappeared, I went upstairs and found June asleep sideways across our bed with one sneaker still on and Caleb starfished under our blankets like he owned the mortgage. Hannah was sitting beside them scrolling on her phone, waiting up for me. I sat down next to her and said, "I feel awful." She nodded, "I know." Then I said, after a minute, "I also feel relieved." She leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "That's how you know you did the right thing." I don't know if there's a clean ending to stories like this. Real family damage doesn't wrap up with a final speech and a lesson learned. It just changes form over time. Some people get softer, some get smaller, some stay exactly the same and call that consistency. What I know is this. My parents asked me for a place to stay, and for the first time in my life, I didn't rearrange myself to make room for what they'd broken. Story 3. I found out my mother-in-law's name was on my house because of a property tax letter she had no business receiving. That's the whole story in one sentence, but it took me 7 years of marriage, 1 inheritance, 1,000 little red flags, and 1 extremely stupid man to get there. I'm 35. My husband, or I guess technically still my husband for the moment, is Eric, 38. His mother Carol is 64, retired, deeply nosy, and one of those women who can make an insult sound like a casserole recipe. We live outside Columbus, Indiana, Westerville. Or I did, until all of this blew up. When I met Eric, I honestly thought I had gotten lucky. He was funny in that dry, quiet way that doesn't draw attention to itself. He remembered tiny details, like how I hated raw onions and always froze in movie theaters. He worked in medical equipment sales and had this whole steady, dependable vibe that felt especially attractive because my 20s had been a parade of men who were either allergic to commitment or thought having a beard and a podcast microphone counted as a personality. The only issue, even early on, was Carol. At first I told myself she was just protective because Eric was her only child. His dad had left when Eric was 12. Not died, left. Moved to Arizona with a woman from his office and basically started a new life. Carol never really got over it, which I understood on some level. But she built her whole identity around being the abandoned wife and the mother who gave everything for her son. Eric had spent so many years being her emotional support animal that by the time I came along, he didn't even recognize how abnormal some of it was. She called him every morning. Every single morning. Not once in a while if something came up. I mean every morning, usually between 7:10 and 7:30, while he was getting ready for work. If he didn't answer, she'd leave a sighing voicemail like she was standing on a cliff in a Bronte novel. Just wanted to make sure you were alive. I guess you're busy. It's fine, I know you have your own life now. If he was with me, he'd roll his eyes, but he'd still call her back. Always. The first time I went to her condo for dinner, she hugged me, smiled, and said, "You're prettier than the last one." More wholesome. That should have told me everything I needed to know. Instead I laughed because I thought maybe she was socially awkward. She wasn't socially awkward, she was strategic. Carol had a way of saying invasive things while acting like she was being warm. When Eric and I got engaged, she took my hand at dinner and said, "I'm just so relieved he finally found someone practical. He needs a woman who won't take advantage." I remember smiling and saying, "Good thing I'm not marrying him for his Honda Accord." She laughed too loudly and said, "Oh, Lauren, I like you because you can take a joke." That became a theme. Everything mean was a joke. Everything controlling was concern. Every boundary violation was her just being close with her son. Still, the first couple years of our marriage were mostly good. We rented a 2-bedroom apartment in Gahana. I worked as a project coordinator for a hospital network. Eric traveled a lot for work, and when he was home we had a simple routine I genuinely loved. Thursday takeout, Saturday grocery trip, Sunday coffee on the balcony and him pretending to understand whatever true crime documentary I had on while he scrolled fantasy football nonsense on his phone. We talked a lot about buying a house. Not in the dreamy Pinterest way. In the tired millennial way where you sit with a calculator and say things like, "If we don't go on vacation for 2 years and my bonus doesn't disappear, maybe." Then my grandmother died. Not suddenly, exactly. She was 86 and had been declining for a while. But she had raised me as much as my parents did. My mom worked nights when I was little, and my dad drove trucks. My grandma Ruth was the one who taught me how to make pot roast, how to keep a savings account, how to look at a contract before you signed it, which is almost funny now if it didn't make me want to scream. When she died, she left me a little over $90,000. It wasn't life-changing rich people money, but to me it felt enormous. Ruth had owned a tiny paid-off house in Newark, drove the same Buick for 15 years, and clipped coupons like it was a sport. The idea that she had quietly tucked away that much and left it to me made me cry harder than the funeral did. Eric was incredibly sweet about it at first. He told me to take my time deciding what to do. He said it was from her, so I should use it in a way that felt right. He even said, "If you want to keep every cent of that separate, I get it." Which, in hindsight, almost makes me laugh. Because apparently he was planning his own, separate, arrangement at the exact same time. I decided the best use of the money would be a down payment. We had been trying to save for years, and suddenly we didn't have to keep pretending we could out-budget the housing market. So we started looking. This was in 2021, when houses were selling in about 6 minutes and every listing looked like it had been staged by the same woman with an obsession for gray floors and signs that said "Gather." We lost out on 3 houses before we found the one on Willow Creek Lane. It was a 2-story brick colonial on a corner lot, built in the late 90s, with a big maple tree in the front and a ridiculous amount of beige everywhere. Beige walls, beige carpet, beige tile, beige soul. But it had good bones. 4 bedrooms, a real backyard, a wide kitchen, and a little office with French doors that I immediately pictured turning into my workspace. I loved it in a way that felt dangerous. Eric loved it too. Carol loved it more than either of us, which should have been another warning. When we first toured it, she somehow ended up there too. That had not been my idea. Our realtor was a woman named Denise, and I had assumed it would be the 2 of us and her. But as we pulled up, Carol's silver SUV was already parked at the curb. Eric said, "She was nearby." Nobody is ever nearby on purpose when they are Carol. Inside, she walked around with her hands clasped like she was blessing the property. She stood in the kitchen and said, "Finally, enough cabinet space." "Lauren, you won't have to stack your pans like you do in that apartment." I said, "Good to know my cookware arrangement has been weighing on you." She smiled at me like I was adorable and slightly slow. We put in an offer that night. It got accepted the next morning. I called my mom crying. My dad asked if I had checked the foundation. My best friend Nina texted me 17 exclamation points. Even Carol cried, which at the time I mistook for happiness instead of ownership. Because here's the part that matters. I had just changed jobs that spring. Same field, better pay, but I hadn't been there long enough for the mortgage lender to love my paperwork. My previous employer had merged with another system, there was a whole mess with payroll records, and when we talked to the lender, he said it would be cleaner to do the mortgage in Eric's name only. I asked, very specifically, if I could still be on the deed. He said yes. Denise, our realtor, also said yes. She explained it twice, actually. Mortgage and title were related, but not identical. One person could be on the loan, both could be on the title. I remember all of this clearly because I asked more than once. It was my inheritance money. I was putting down $82,000 between down payment and closing costs. I was not casual about this. Eric told me not to worry. Of course you'll be on it. It's our house. Those exact words. I remember them because later I replayed them so many times I thought I might lose my mind. Closing week was chaos. My dad ended up in the hospital with a nasty infection from a minor surgery that should have been routine. Not life-threatening, but serious enough that my mom was panicking and I was driving back and forth between Columbus and Newark after work. Eric kept telling me he would handle the final title paperwork and all I had to do was review the lender documents that came through electronically. I did. I signed what I was told to sign. The wire for the down payment came from my account. I was exhausted and trusting and stupid in exactly the way a lot of wives are stupid when they assume marriage means the person beside them is not actively building a side door through their life. Closing happened on a Thursday morning. I wasn't there in person because I was with my dad. Eric said it was easier that way, and at the time, that sounded reasonable. That first year in the house was good enough that I buried every uneasy feeling I had. I painted the office sage green. I ripped up ugly landscaping and planted hydrangeas. I bought a giant sectional after spending 2 weeks reading reviews like my life depended on it. We hosted Thanksgiving. We argued over where to hang the TV and whether the upstairs guest room needed blackout curtains. Normal house stuff. Happy house stuff. I paid half the mortgage every month from our joint account, plus more than half of everything else if I'm being honest. Utilities, groceries, furniture, new washer and dryer, the patio set, the light fixtures in the dining room and foyer, the fence we split when the old one rotted, the tree trimming after a storm, the carpet replacement upstairs after Carol's ancient cat peed in the guest room during one of her weekend visits. Yes, weekend visits. That was another thing that got worse slowly. At first Carol would come by on Sundays with banana bread or too many mums for the porch. Then it became, I was in the area and used my key. Then it was, I folded the towels because your linen closet was driving me nuts. Then, I invited Sheila from church over to see what you've done with the kitchen. I had not given Carol a key. Eric had. He said it was for emergencies. Carol treated every impulse like an emergency. Once I came home early from work with a migraine and found her in my bedroom, putting away laundry that I had not asked her to touch. She was standing by my dresser holding one of my bras like it had personally insulted her. I said, "Why are you in here?" She didn't even flinch. Eric said the guest sheets were in the hall closet but they weren't, so I looked around. I just stood there because the sheer audacity of that answer briefly wiped my brain clean. When I told Eric that night that his mother could not just roam through our bedroom, he said, she was trying to help. I said, help with what? Identifying my underwear by cup size? He got annoyed with me for making it into a thing. That phrase came up a lot too. Every violation was only a problem because I made it into a thing. I'm telling you all this because when I finally discovered what he had done with the house, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was shocking, yes, but it was also the natural endpoint of years of him choosing comfort with his mother over honesty with me. The tax letter showed up on a Tuesday in March. It was mixed in with grocery flyers, 2 credit card offers, and something from the county auditor's office. I almost threw it onto the pile unopened, but I noticed the windowed envelope showed Carol's name. Carol Reed. Our address. Not her condo in Dublin. Our house. I thought maybe it was junk mail. Or maybe she had changed her mailing address for something stupid because she was always ordering vitamins and porch signs and miracle skin creams from weird catalogs. I opened it. It was a notice about the property tax reassessment and owner occupancy records. I remember staring at the paper and not understanding what I was looking at because the names listed under property ownership were Eric Reed and Carol Reed. Not Eric Reed and Lauren Reed. Not Eric Reed et al. Not some clerical mistake where my name was misspelled. Eric Reed and Carol Reed. My first feeling wasn't even anger. It was this cold, blank confusion, like walking into your kitchen and finding the refrigerator in the bathtub. I sat down at the counter and read it again. Then I pulled up the county auditor's site. Property search. Address. Enter. There it was. Clean and simple and so absurd it made my ears ring. Owner 1. Eric Reed. Owner 2. Carol Reed. I clicked through to the transfer history because at that point my hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the mouse. The deed had been recorded the same week we closed. Same month, same house, same money. I was never on it. Never. He hadn't secretly added his mother later. He had put her there from the beginning. I called him immediately. He didn't answer. I texted. Call me now. He replied 10 minutes later, in a meeting. What's wrong? I sent a picture of the tax notice. 3 dots. Then nothing. I called again. This time he answered. He sounded cautious. Hey, why is your mother's name on my house? Silence. Not confusion. Not, what are you talking about? Not, that has to be a mistake. Silence. Then, Lauren, let's talk when I get home. No, we are talking now. He exhaled. I'm driving between offices. I don't care if you're piloting a plane. Why is Carol's name on the house? He got quiet again, then said the words that ended my marriage more than the deed did. I was going to tell you. People say that like it helps. I laughed. It came out ugly. When? On our 10th anniversary? It's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. He started with the kind of explanation people use when they know the real one sounds terrible if said plainly. It was complicated. His mom had helped. It was a paperwork thing. It was temporary. He didn't want to stress me while my dad was sick. I said, stop, say one true sentence. More silence. Then he said, Mom wanted protection. I actually felt my whole body go hot. Protection from who? Another pause. He didn't say me. He didn't have to. I said, very slowly, you used my grandmother's money to buy a house and put your mother on it because she wanted protection from me? He jumped in fast after that. Carol had contributed $5,000 when closing costs came in higher than expected. That part was true, technically. She had offered money at the last minute. I found out later we didn't even need it, but he took it anyway. He said since she was helping, and since my job situation had been unstable, and since you never know what can happen in marriages, he thought this arrangement made sense. This arrangement, that was what he called cutting me out of the title to the home I funded and lived in. I asked if Denise knew. He said no. I asked if the lender knew I thought I was supposed to be on the deed. He said that wasn't relevant. I asked whether Carol knew I didn't know. He hesitated long enough to answer the question without using words. I said, put that in plain English too. He snapped then. Not remorse. Annoyance. Yes, she knew. I don't think I have ever gone from hurt to calm so fast in my life. Not calm because I was okay. Calm because something in me locked into place. I said, okay. He seemed confused by my tone. Okay? Yeah, come home after work. Then I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't break dishes. I didn't call my friends screaming. I pulled every house document I had into a folder on the dining table. Wiring records, closing emails, bank statements, the receipt for the washer and dryer, the invoice for the fence, appliance warranties, carpet estimate, every stupid Home Depot run for paint and light fixtures and mulch. If I had ever spent money on that house, I wanted proof. Eric got home around 6:30. He walked in doing that cautious half-smile people use when they've already decided you're overreacting and they just need to wait you out. Carol was with him. That is how insane this whole thing was. He brought his mother to the confrontation about secretly giving her ownership in my house. She came in behind him carrying a lemon loaf like we were having a hard but loving family talk. I still remember the sight of it. That stupid loaf in wax paper. I said, absolutely not. Carol stopped in the foyer. Lauren, honey. No, you do not get to, honey, me in my house. Eric immediately stiffened. Don't talk to her like that. I looked at him. Your concern for tone right now is incredible. Carol put the loaf on the counter, because of course she did, and clasped her hands. I know this looks bad. You knew I didn't know, I said. She gave me this sad, patient look like I was a child melting down at Target. Eric didn't want to upset you when so much was going on with your father. I said, you are on my deed. Our deed, Eric corrected. That one little correction hit me so hard I actually laughed. No, apparently it's yours and your mother's. He started talking over me, saying I was being dramatic, that nothing about our day-to-day lives had changed, that it was just legal structure, that Carol would never do anything to harm us. Carol nodded solemnly and added, this was simply a way to keep the home secure in the family. Secure in the family. I said, what am I? Neither of them answered. That was the moment I understood the real thing. They did not see me as family in any permanent sense. I was the wife, yes. I was the person cooking in the kitchen and paying the utility bills and filling the rooms. But in their minds, blood was real and I was conditional. I asked Eric, did you ever intend to put me on it? He said, eventually, yes. I asked when. He said, when things settled down. It had been 3 years. I turned to Carol, and if I had never found out? She gave a tiny shrug that made me want to set fire to the lemon loaf. You would have been none the wiser. There it was, open, clean, the kind of honesty some people only manage when they're too arrogant to realize they should be ashamed. Eric shot her a look, but it was too late. I said, get out. Eric said, Lauren? I looked at him, you too. Carol drew herself up and said, you're upset now, but once you think rationally. Get out of my house. That time I said it loud enough that even Eric took a step back. He tried texting me from the driveway, then calling, then knocking again. I didn't answer any of it. Instead I called a real estate attorney my coworker had used during a property line dispute. Her name was Andrea Levin. I got her voicemail and left a message that I'm sure sounded clinically insane because I was trying so hard not to sound emotional. She called me back the next morning. I took an early lunch and sat in my car in the hospital parking garage while I explained everything from the inheritance to the county record search to the smug lemon loaf summit. Andrea listened quietly, then asked for copies of the closing documents and proof of my contributions. By that afternoon I was sitting in her office in Upper Arlington with a legal pad in front of me and the worst dry mouth of my life. She was efficient in a way I loved immediately. No fake sympathy voice. No, let's just breathe. Just facts. Because the house was purchased during the marriage, because the down payment came largely from my inherited funds, because marital money had been used to pay the mortgage and improvements, and because Eric had intentionally concealed the title arrangement, she said I had serious claims even though my name was not on the deed. Not magical fix-it claims. Not, everything is fine. But real ones. She asked the question I had been weirdly afraid to ask out loud. Are you trying to save the marriage or protect yourself? I stared at her for maybe 2 seconds and said, protect myself. She nodded like she'd already known. Then she gave me the best advice anyone gave me through the whole thing. Stop paying toward an asset controlled by your husband and his mother unless and until we decide strategically otherwise. Open a separate account, move your direct deposit, gather every financial record, inventory the contents of the house. Do not announce any of this before you do it. That last part especially landed. Do not announce any of this before you do it. So that's what I did next. I didn't scream. I didn't beg to be added. I didn't sit at the kitchen table crying while Eric and Carol explained to me why I should accept being a tenant in my own marriage. I got organized. That weekend Eric stayed at Carol's condo because I had told him not to come home. He kept texting things like we can work this out and you're letting my mom get blamed for something I decided and I hate that this is being blown up over paperwork. Over paperwork. 3 years of deception, my inheritance, my home, and he still needed it to be paperwork. While he was busy reframing betrayal into logistics, I started taking pictures. Every room, every piece of furniture I had bought. The dining table my parents gave us but technically gifted to both of us, so I left that out. The sectional, mine. The washer and dryer, mine. Patio furniture, mine. Guest bed, mine. My desk, file cabinet, rugs, lamps, dishes, stand mixer, television in the den, all mine. I pulled receipts from email and matched them to photos like I was building a criminal case, which in a way I was. Nina came over Sunday with iced coffee and that dangerous look best friends get when they're prepared to help you commit a felony if needed. I told her everything. She sat on my living room floor in leggings and said, very calmly, I am begging one of these people to try me. Then she helped me label boxes. I rented a storage unit first. Then, after another meeting with Andrea and a consult with a divorce attorney she recommended, I signed a lease on a furnished month-to-month apartment in Grandview. I didn't tell Eric. I also moved my paycheck to a separate account and changed every autopay connected to me personally. Internet, electric, streaming services, grocery deliveries, home supply subscriptions, the cleaning service Carol insisted I treat myself to twice a month and somehow never paid for herself when she stayed over. Done. Gone. I left the mortgage payment untouched for one more month on Andrea's advice while we prepared formal notices. After that, I stopped contributing directly and documented exactly why. The part that still makes me laugh is that Eric apparently thought I just needed space. That's how deeply he misunderstood me. He thought if he gave me a few days to cool off, I would come around to some version of compromise. Maybe Carol would sign something symbolic. Maybe I'd get my feelings out and then go back to folding towels in the house his mother legally co-owned. He had no idea I was building an exit. 2 weeks after I found out, he called and said, "Can we have dinner and talk like adults?" I said, "We can talk. We're not having dinner." He came over after work. I made sure it was in a public place, a coffee shop with terrible lighting and a lot of people pretending to work on laptops. He looked tired. Good. He sat down and immediately said, "I should have told you sooner." That sentence always fascinates me. So close to accountability and still somehow dodging it. Sooner than what? The 4-year mark? When Carol died, I said nothing. He leaned forward. I know this looks bad. Then you do understand reality. Lauren, stop. No, Eric, you stop. I asked a dozen times whether I'd be on the deed. He rubbed his face. I was trying to keep everyone protected. Everyone except your wife. It's not like that. Then say what it is like. He got frustrated again, which was sort of his default any time a conversation required moral clarity. Mom got screwed over in her divorce. She has nothing. She panicked. She said with divorce rates, and with your job being unstable then, and with you putting in inherited money that could get complicated if something happened. I actually interrupted him. You do realize that sentence makes you sound worse, right? He blinked. You and your mother sat around discussing how to protect a house from the woman funding it. That's not fair. It is exactly fair. He asked what I wanted. An apology? My name added now? Carol willing to sign a document saying she had no practical claim unless something happened to him? I almost admired the audacity. I said, you still think the problem is paperwork. The problem is that you and your mother lied to me for years and built our marriage around the assumption that I was temporary. He looked genuinely bewildered by that. Not because he disagreed, because he had never let himself think about it in words that direct. Then he said something that finished whatever was left between us. I didn't think you'd leave over this. Not, I didn't think it would hurt you this much. Not, I realize now how awful this was. I didn't think you'd leave. I remember sitting back in that hard coffee shop chair and realizing the hidden center of everything. He knew it was wrong. He just didn't believe I'd do anything about it. He thought I'd absorb it like I had absorbed every smaller thing. The key, the laundry, the drop-ins, the comments, the constant choosing of her over me as long as it never got dramatic enough to embarrass him. I said, that's the first honest thing you've said. Then I stood up and left. A week later, Carol moved from passive to aggressive. She showed up at the house on a Saturday morning while I was there boxing books and winter clothes. I had not moved out yet. I was doing it in stages because I was trying to avoid chaos and because Andrea told me not to abandon the property before we had our paperwork in place. Carol walked in with her key, saw the boxes, and her face changed instantly. What is all this? Packing. For what? I sealed a box with tape and said, for my move. She set down her purse slowly. Don't be ridiculous. It really is amazing how some people here, my husband and mother-in-law tricked me out of ownership of the family home, and think the unreasonable part is the woman buying packing tape. She came farther into the living room and lowered her voice into that fake intimate register she used when she wanted to sound wise. Lauren, I know you're hurt. But grown women don't blow up their lives over pride. I laughed. You secretly took legal ownership in my home and you think this is about pride? It was never your home alone. And it was never yours at all. Her expression hardened. There it was, the real Carol. The one behind the pot roasts and lemon loaves. You need to understand something. Eric has responsibilities beyond you. I said, and none of them include honesty? She crossed her arms. I protected my son. From what? She gave me a long look, then said, from being naive. I just stared at her. Then she added, because apparently she really couldn't help herself, women can change after marriage. They can decide what's theirs is theirs and what's his is theirs too. I've seen it. There are few experiences stranger than realizing someone has smiled in your kitchen for years while quietly classifying you as a threat. I said, get out. She did, but not before giving me a little nod like she was the one being patient. That afternoon I called Andrea and told her I wanted to move faster. We filed. I'm not going to pretend I understand every legal detail, because I don't. That's what I paid people for. But the short version is that I filed for divorce, asserted my equitable claims related to the house and my separate property contribution, and put them on formal notice that I intended to pursue reimbursement and whatever relief the court would allow. It was the first time Eric stopped acting like this was a marital spat. Because suddenly he had lawyers calling him about tracing inheritance funds, concealed title decisions, and asset characterization. Suddenly his mother's cute little protection scheme wasn't a private family arrangement. It was an ugly fact in legal language. That was also when I finished moving. I chose a Thursday because Eric was on a day trip to Toledo and Carol had a standing hair appointment at noon that she treated with religious seriousness. Nina came. My brother came. 2 movers came. I had everything labeled and ready. I did not gut the house. I took what was mine and only what was mine. But let me tell you, when one person has furnished and supplied most of a house, what is mine can make a room look extremely different very quickly. The living room lost the sectional, the rug, the lamp, the coffee table, the art, and the side chairs. The den lost the television and media console. The guest room lost the bed, dresser, and bedding. The kitchen lost all the nice cookware, dishes I'd bought, small appliances, serving pieces, and the espresso machine Eric suddenly loved only after I bought it. The patio lost the furniture, planters, and string lights. My office obviously went, so did every plant that had managed not to die under my care, which felt spiritually important. I left the marital bed because I didn't want it. I left the dining table because it was a joint gift. I left the ugly leather recliner Eric had insisted on buying because frankly it looked like divorced dad energy made into furniture. By 3 o'clock, the house echoed. I put my key on the kitchen counter beside a manila envelope addressed to Eric. Inside was a copy of the filed petition, a temporary financial notice from my attorney, and one handwritten note from me. Since your mother is on the title, I'm sure the 2 of you can manage the house just fine. Petty? Maybe, but I was beyond caring. Eric called me 18 times that night. I answered once. He sounded breathless, furious. Did you strip the house? No, I removed my property. You took everything. No, I left your recliner. He actually made this strangled sound like he couldn't decide whether to yell or plead. Lauren, what the hell is wrong with you? I said, I'm not furnishing a home your mother co-owns. You blindsided me. There's something almost artistic about a man saying that after he spent years hiding a deed. I said, that must be a terrible feeling. He started in on how humiliating it had been to come home and see half the house gone. How Carol had cried. How the neighbors probably noticed. I said, interesting. I remember a similar feeling when I found out my husband and his mother had been lying to me since closing day. He went quiet for a second, then tried a different tack. Mom's going to sign something. What? A paper. Waiving claim unless I die or whatever. We can fix this. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor of my new apartment eating Thai takeout out of the container, surrounded by boxes and silence, and I actually smiled. No, I said, we can't. Then I hung up. The next few months were ugly in the boring way legal fights are ugly. Not dramatic movie ugly, spreadsheet ugly, affidavit ugly, bank record ugly, but that kind of ugly has its own satisfaction because it strips away people's preferred stories. Eric wanted to pretend this had been an innocent misunderstanding. The paper trail did not support that. The down payment wire came from my inherited funds. The closing emails showed repeated references to me being included. There were texts from me asking, "Are we both on everything for the house?" And him replying, "Yes, babe, all set." That one turned out to be especially useful. Andrea was a shark in a navy blazer. She traced everything: my inheritance, our mortgage payments, the capital improvements I had funded, the fact that Carol had received tax notices and owner correspondence at our address, the fact that no one had ever disclosed to me that she held title, the fact that her $5,000 contribution, which Eric had leaned on so heavily in his explanations, was both smaller than claimed and largely unnecessary. I learned things too. Carol had not just wanted protection. She had told Eric explicitly, before closing, that if a marriage ever goes south, he'd be glad to have kept the house in Reed hands. Reed hands. That phrase came out in discovery from an email she sent him. I printed it and stared at it for a long time. Reed hands. I had lived in that house, painted walls, planted hydrangeas, hosted Christmas, scrubbed baseboards, made mortgage payments, and none of it counted as family because my last name had started differently when I was born. When Eric's attorney saw how bad the facts were, their tone changed. Suddenly there was more openness to settlement. Suddenly Carol was willing to be flexible. Suddenly I was no longer overreacting. I was a person with documented claims and competent counsel. The funniest part is that Carol herself made everything worse because she could never resist talking. At mediation, which happened in a bland office park conference room with stale coffee and the world's saddest carpet, she asked if she could speak, woman to woman, while the attorneys were stepping out. I should have said no. But I was curious. She turned to me and said, in this pained, almost maternal voice, "I wish you had not made this so public." I looked at her. "You mean legal?" She ignored that. "If you had just calmed down, Eric would have worked something out." After 3 years? He needed time. I genuinely laughed. To tell his wife who owned her house? She leaned in and said, barely above a whisper, "You could still stop this. You could go home. We could put it behind us." We. There it was again. Not me and Eric. Me joining her version of the family if I behaved. I said, "Carol, you were willing to let me spend years paying into a house you knew I had no ownership in." Her lips tightened. "You benefited from living there." The absolute clarity that came over me in that moment was almost peaceful. I said, "And you benefited from me making it worth living in." Then I stood up and walked out of the room. We settled 6 weeks later. Again, not going into every legal detail, but the short version is this. They could not simply erase my financial stake because Eric had been stupid and arrogant. My inheritance contribution mattered. My documented expenditures mattered. The concealment mattered. The marriage mattered. In the end, Carol had to come off the title, and the house had to be refinanced and partially liquidated to satisfy the settlement. They fought hard against selling, because of course they did. Carol acted like the idea of losing her house was a personal assault from the heavens. But once the numbers were laid out, there wasn't a magical way around them. Eric couldn't afford the house on his own under the new terms. Carol couldn't afford to buy out the part one was entitled to without gutting her retirement. They dragged it out for a while, then finally did what they should have done from the beginning and accepted reality. The house sold. I did not go to the closing. I did not drive by for one last look. I did not stand in the yard mourning the hydrangeas. By that point, I was tired in a way that had no poetry left in it. Nina did send me the listing when it hit online, though. The pictures made me laugh because the house looked dead. Not dirty, not ugly, just dead. All my color and texture and plants and furniture gone, replaced by bland staging that made every room look like a dentist's waiting area. The maple tree out front was still there. The office was still sage green because apparently nobody bothered repainting it. That part weirdly pleased me. When the sale went through and the settlement funds hit my account, I sat in my apartment parking lot and cried for maybe 10 minutes. Not because I wanted the house back. Because it was over. Because I had spent so much time doubting myself, replaying conversations, wondering if I was making too much of it, wondering if maybe the normal wife thing was to accept some version of being lied to in the name of family security. Then I remembered Carol saying, "You benefited from living there." And I laughed through tears like a lunatic. A few people in Eric's family decided I was the villain, naturally. His cousin Megan posted one of those vague social media things about people who destroy families over greed. I almost responded that greed was secretly taking ownership of someone else's home, but I decided against it. Eric's aunt called my mother, which was a very middle American family move, and asked whether I had always been this headstrong. My mother, bless her, said, "Only when she's right," and hung up. My dad was less polite. Apparently, when someone from Eric's side implied I had taken him to the cleaners, Dad said, "He's lucky she didn't bury him in the backyard." That sounds more violent than my father actually is. He's 70 and complains if the newspaper is folded wrong. But the sentiment was appreciated. The part that probably bothers Eric most is that I didn't spend the settlement money on something dramatic. I didn't blow it on revenge shopping or post triumphant vacation pictures or buy a giant house to prove a point. I bought a condo. Not flashy, not sad either, just mine. It's in Bexley, on a quiet street with old trees and a tiny balcony and a kitchen that needed cosmetic work but had really good natural light. I closed 6 months after the divorce was finalized. My name is the only one on the deed. I checked it so many times the title company probably thought I was unstable. Maybe I was. When I signed those papers, I thought of Ruth, my grandmother, her careful hands, her savings envelopes, the way she used to say, "Always know whose name is where." I used to think she meant labels in the basement freezer. Turns out she meant life. I painted this place myself. Slow, one room at a time. Deep blue in the bedroom. Soft white everywhere else. I bought a smaller couch because I wanted one, not because someone else thought it looked good. I put plants on the balcony and no one criticized whether they were practical. I have never once come home and found another woman in my bedroom holding my laundry. As for Eric, the last time we had a real conversation was at the courthouse after one of the final hearings. He caught up to me in the hallway while our attorneys were off doing attorney things. He looked older, not dramatically, just worn. Like a man who had spent a year learning that actions do, in fact, produce consequences. He said, "I still think this got bigger than it had to." I turned and looked at him because I genuinely wanted to see if he believed that or just needed to. Then he said, "If you had just told me how serious it was to you." I cut him off. "I was your wife." He frowned like he didn't understand. I said, "That was supposed to be enough." And I left. Carol, for her part, sent me one final text months later from a number I hadn't blocked yet. "I hope you're happy with what you've done." I stared at it for a while. Not because I didn't know the answer. Because it was such a perfect Carol sentence. No accountability, no shame, just wounded self-righteousness dressed up like concern. I didn't answer. The truth is, happy wasn't the word for a long time. Relieved was closer, clearer, quieter, less haunted, but there was one moment, maybe 9 months after everything blew up, when I did feel something close to happy. I was in my new condo on a Saturday morning, standing barefoot in my kitchen making coffee. The balcony door was cracked open. It had rained overnight, and everything smelled like wet leaves and clean air. My phone was on the counter. No missed calls from Carol. No tense silence from Eric. No tax letters with someone else's name. Just my place, my coffee, my ridiculous basil plant that refuses to die. And I thought, very simply, this is what safety feels like when it doesn't come with a condition. I still get angry sometimes, though. Usually not about the money. Money was the easiest part to measure. It's the disrespect that lingers. The sheer confidence they both had that I would keep loving under terms I hadn't agreed to. That I would keep paying into a future from which I could be edited out at any time. That's the part that still catches me. Because if I hadn't opened that tax letter, how long would it have gone on? 5 more years? 10? Until Carol moved in, temporarily, after a health scare, and suddenly I was sharing a kitchen with a woman who legally outranked me in my own home. Until Eric died first and I found out the whole property bypassed me entirely. Until a divorce where I walked in thinking we were dividing our marital home and discovered I was, on paper, negotiating over Carol's investment property. People love asking when I knew the marriage was over. They expect me to say the day I found out, or the mediation, or the move out. But if I'm honest, it ended on the phone when he said, "Mom wanted protection." Because that was the whole marriage in miniature. His mother wanted something unreasonable, and instead of telling her no, he built our life around it and expected me to adjust. He really did not expect what I did next. I don't think either of them expected me to get quiet. They expected crying, maybe pleading, maybe one of those long emotional wife speeches in the kitchen where I list all the ways I've been wronged and then accept half a promise because I'm too tired to keep fighting. Instead, I called lawyers, changed bank accounts, documented receipts, took my furniture, and forced their little family arrangement into daylight. Carol thought putting her name on my house would guarantee her son kept control if the marriage ever went bad. What it actually did was make sure that when it fell apart, she got dragged right into the center of it and lost the house anyway. And Eric, who spent years treating me like the least permanent person in the room, had to watch me walk away with enough of my own money recovered to start over somewhere he wasn't invited. Story 4. My family laughed when I was fired. Months later, they were shocked to see me as their new landlord. I got fired on a Tuesday at 10:17 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I looked at the little digital clock in the conference room when my boss, Brent, pushed a white envelope toward me and wouldn't quite meet my eyes. The room smelled like burnt coffee and carpet cleaner. HR was there doing that fake soft voice people use when they're about to change your life in a way that absolutely does not benefit you. They called it a restructuring. That's always what they call it when they want you gone but don't want to say they're getting rid of you. I was 34, had worked for the same medical supply company in Dayton for almost 9 years, and I'd spent most of my adult life being the stable one. I was operations manager for a regional warehouse, which sounds more impressive than it felt. Mostly it meant I was the guy people called when 3 trucks were late, 2 people quit, 1 pallet jack died, and a hospital system was screaming because their shipment hadn't arrived. I worked stupid hours. I missed birthdays. I answered emails from bed. I knew the direct extensions of people I hated in 4 different states. And then some company from Chicago bought us, decided they could streamline leadership, and I got a severance packet, a handshake, and 30 minutes to clean out my office. Brent said, "This isn't a reflection of your performance." HR said, "You'll be eligible for 8 weeks severance and outplacement support." I said, "Right." That was basically the whole meeting. 9 years turned into an envelope and a polite escort to my desk. I put my framed photo of my dog in a box, grabbed a desk mug that said "World's Okayest Manager," and walked out through the warehouse trying not to look at anybody. A couple of the floor guys gave me that sad nod men give each other when they don't know what to say. It almost made me cry, which would have been embarrassing in steel-toe boots in the middle of Bay 4, so I kept moving. I sat in my car for probably 20 minutes in the parking lot just staring at the steering wheel. I should have gone home. I should have turned my phone off and taken the day. Instead, because I'm apparently addicted to making bad choices when I'm emotionally wrecked, I called my mom. My mom, Linda, is 63 and has a way of taking any piece of news and immediately figuring out how it reflects on the family as a whole. "Not on you, on the family." I knew that. I still called. She answered on the second ring and said, "Are you coming for dinner tonight? Candace is making pot roast." I said, "Yeah, I'll come." She said, "You sound strange." I stared through the windshield at a shopping cart rolling loose across the lot and said, "I got laid off." There was a pause, not a long one, just enough for me to feel stupid for saying it out loud. Then she said, "Well, I guess you can explain it tonight." Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Not even, "I'm sorry." Just that. I should have taken the hint. I still went. For context, my family had dinner together every Tuesday at my sister Candace's rental house in Kettering. Candace is 38, married to Scott, and they have 2 kids, Lily, who was 10 then, and Owen, who was 7. My dad, Ray, 66, and my mom lived with them because my dad retired after a back surgery and they couldn't really afford their condo anymore once the Waffees jumped and the medical bills piled up. So Candace and Scott took the upstairs bedrooms. My parents had the first floor den and attached bath, and the whole arrangement was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. I was the reason they got that house in the first place. The house belonged to my landlady, Elena Alvarez, a 69-year-old widow who owned a few rental properties around the Dayton area. I'd been renting a small carriage house apartment behind one of her duplexes for 2 years after a breakup, and over time I started helping her with little stuff. Setting up online rent payments, fixing a doorbell camera, replacing a garbage disposal, making her a spreadsheet because her bookkeeping was all handwritten in legal pads and she hated those damn portals. Elena liked me because I showed up when I said I would and because I didn't talk down to her. I liked her because she was direct, funny, and fed me tamales every December whether I protested or not. When Candace and Scott needed a bigger place after Scott's tax mess wrecked their credit and my parents had to get out of their condo, I asked Elena if she had anything available. She had that old 5-bedroom colonial on East Patterson with the weird sunroom and the detached garage. I vouched for them. I paid half the security deposit because Candace called me crying. Elena took a chance on them because I asked. That matters later. Anyway, I drove to dinner that night already hollowed out, and the whole time I kept telling myself maybe my mom had just been surprised on the phone. Maybe in person it'd be different. Maybe they'd act like normal people. I got there around 6:15. Scott's truck was in the driveway half on the lawn like always. The porch light was on even though it was still bright out. I could hear Owen yelling from inside and the TV blasting some sports thing from the living room. Candace was at the stove in leggings and an old UD hoodie, hair in a messy bun, stirring gravy. My mom was slicing bread. My dad was in his recliner. Scott had a beer already. My younger brother Eric, who was 28 and drifting between apartments and bad ideas, was at the kitchen table scrolling on his phone. Candace looked over and said, "You look like hell." I said, "Thanks." Nobody laughed at that, not yet. I put the bottle of wine I'd brought on the counter out of habit and immediately felt stupid, like I was still playing the role of reliable older brother when I no longer had the paycheck to back it up. My mom said, "Go ahead, tell everyone." I actually remember that she didn't even turn around when she said it. She kept cutting bread, so I did. I said, "They eliminated my position this morning. The company got bought out and they cut most of regional operations." There was a beat of silence. Then Eric laughed. Not a polite awkward laugh. An actual short bark of laughter through his nose, like he'd heard something genuinely funny. Scott looked at him, smirked, and took a sip of beer. Candace gave me this wide-eyed look and said, "Wait, seriously?" I said, "Yeah." She shook her head once, not sympathetically, more like she was impressed by the gossip value of it. Then Scott said, "Damn. So the corporate golden child can get canned after all." Eric laughed again. My dad let out one of those dry little chuckles he does when he wants to say something mean but package it as a joke. I just stood there for a second because I honestly thought I'd misread the room. I said, "I'm not kidding." Candace leaned back against the counter and said, "No, I know. It's just, wow, you always acted like your company couldn't function without you." I said, "I never said that." She gave me a look that basically meant yes, you did, even though I absolutely did not. Then my dad said, "Maybe next time you'll learn not to make work your whole personality." My mom added, still cutting bread, "And maybe now you'll understand what it's like when money gets tight instead of lecturing everybody." That one hit because I knew exactly what she meant. For years, I had been the person they called when something went wrong. Candace needed help with Lily's braces. Eric needed money for a transmission. My parents needed help with a deductible when a pipe burst. Scott needed just a little float between landscaping jobs. I had been helping since I was 25, and I'm not saying that to brag. It's honestly part of why they resented me. Because after a while I started saying no. Not all the time, just enough that they noticed. The last big fight before I got fired had been over Scott wanting $4,000 to bridge his seasonal slowdown. I told him no. I told Candace she and Scott needed to stop treating every month like some miracle had occurred when the bills came due. She said I talked to them like employees. My mom said I was getting arrogant. Eric said I thought I was better than everyone because I wore button-downs to work. So now, standing in that kitchen having just lost my job, I suddenly understood why there was this weird little spark of satisfaction in the room. It wasn't just bad timing. They were enjoying it. Scott set his beer down and said, "Well, hey, maybe you can come work with me. You know, do some honest labor for once." That got another laugh. I said, "I did honest labor." Scott shrugged. "Yeah, with a laptop." Candace snorted. I wish I could say I made some brilliant speech or told them all off right there, but I didn't. When people you love show you something ugly, sometimes your brain doesn't react with anger first. Sometimes it just blanks out. My mom finally turned and looked at me and said, "Did you at least get severance?" I said yes. She nodded once, practical as ever. "Then you'll be all right." And Eric, still grinning, said, guess we know who's not picking up dinner next week." Everybody laughed, even my dad. That was the moment something in me really settled. Not broke, settled, like a glass put down on a table after shaking in somebody's hand. I stayed through dinner because I was too stunned to leave right away. I barely tasted anything. The kids were actually the only normal ones. Lily asked if I was still going to take her to the bookstore Saturday, and Owen wanted to show me a Lego thing. Candace kept making little comments about free time. Scott asked if I was going to sell my car. My dad told me construction companies were always hiring if I didn't mind, starting at the bottom like normal people. My mom asked, in front of everyone, "Should we expect you to be able to help with Easter like you usually do, or do you need to tighten your belt?" I looked at her and said, "I got fired this morning." She said, "I know. I'm asking." Not once that entire night did anybody say they were sorry. Not once did anyone ask how I was doing. When I left, Candace called after me from the porch, "Don't get dramatic, Adam." We were joking. I turned around and asked, "Which part was the joke?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Scott was behind her with his hand on the frame, smiling that tight little smile he does when he thinks he's won something. So I got in my car and drove home. The group chat started before I even made it back to my apartment. Eric sent a meme of a guy carrying a box out of an office building. Candace sent, "Too soon?" My mom sent one of those crying laughing emojis. That was it for me. I muted the chat and didn't answer. The next few weeks were ugly in the boring, private way ugly usually is. I filed unemployment. I updated my resume. I had 3 interviews that went nowhere because every company wanted someone to do 2 jobs for 20 grand less than what I'd been making. I cleaned out my closet. I slept badly. I got up too early because my body was used to warehouse hours and then spent half the day pretending not to panic. What made it worse was how quickly my family decided my firing was a personality correction from the universe. Candace called 2 days later asking if I could still cover Lily's dance recital fee, since you got severance. I told her no. She got quiet for a second, then said, "Wow. You'd think not having a job would make you less stingy, not more." Eric texted me asking if I wanted him to put in a word at the tire place where his friend worked. Then he followed it with, "No offense, but maybe it'd humble you a little." My dad left me a voicemail saying, "This could turn out to be the best thing for you if you stop being so proud." My mom called to ask if I had looked into selling my apartment furniture before things got really bad. That same call somehow turned into her asking if I could still help with Owen's birthday gift since I'd already planned on it. I started ignoring a lot of them. And the funny thing was, once I stopped replying right away, I realized almost every message from my family had a transaction hidden in it. A request, a guilt trip, a criticism wrapped in concern. Meanwhile, Elena, my landlady, was the one person who actually behaved like a human being. She noticed I was around the property more during the day and asked if I was on vacation. I told her what happened. She set down the basket of folded rags she was carrying and said, "Those idiots." I said, "My company?" She said, "Them too. But I meant your family. Your mother has been in this house. She knows what you do for them." I must have looked surprised because she shrugged and said, "You think old women don't notice things?" Elena had that way about her. She'd never pry, but she saw everything. I ended up helping her a lot that spring because I needed something to do that wasn't spiraling in my own apartment. She had a vacancy in one of her duplexes in Belmont, and I painted the bedroom for her. I helped her organize receipts. I sat at her kitchen table drinking bad coffee while she complained about insurance costs and the city's new inspection fees. One afternoon in April, she asked me if I'd ever thought about buying property. Not in a dreamy way. In a practical, Elena way. Like she was asking if I'd thought about changing my oil. I laughed and said, "With what money?" She tapped the calculator on the table and said, "You'd be surprised what matters more than money. Numbers matter. Reliability matters. Knowing how to fix things matters. Not being stupid matters." I said, "Those are all wonderful qualities. They are not usually accepted as a down payment." She smiled a little and said, "No. But they are accepted by old women who are tired." That was the beginning of it. Elena had been thinking about moving to New Mexico to be near her daughter for over a year. She owned 4 properties outright and had no interest in handing them to some giant management company that would jack up rents and ignore repairs. She hated most investors, openly and with poetry. Her exact phrase was, "I do not want some shaved ape in loafers turning my houses into a spreadsheet." She knew I'd been saving to buy a place eventually. I had around 65 grand set aside between savings, a small brokerage account, and what I'd been calling my, maybe one day, fund. I'd never touched it because I always assumed I needed the perfect moment and a traditional path and all the normal safe steps. Getting fired kind of destroyed my illusion that safe steps meant safety. Elena showed me the books on the Patterson house first. Same house Candace, Scott, my parents, and intermittently Eric were living in. I told her absolutely not. Not because the numbers were bad. The numbers were actually decent. 5-bedroom old house, below market rent but in a stable area, solid bones, big lot, detached garage that could eventually be converted or rented for storage, and Elena had never taken a mortgage on it. The issue was obvious. "My family lives there," I said. Elena nodded. "Yes. That's a reason not to. That is a reason to think carefully. It is not automatically a reason not to." I laughed because I thought she was kidding. She wasn't. She slid the yellow notepad toward me. Purchase price, down payment, owner financing terms, estimated repair reserve, taxes, insurance, rent history, late payment history. That last line mattered, because I learned, sitting there in Elena's kitchen, that my family had been late on rent 6 times in 11 months. I said, "I thought Candace told me they were caught up." Elena gave me a flat look over her glasses. "Adam, your sister tells many stories." I felt this slow, sick anger rise in my chest because 3 of those months were months when Candace had called me saying school costs had blindsided them or Scott's truck had unexpected repairs. 2 of those times, I'd sent money. Not directly for rent because they knew I hated that. I'd paid the electric once. I'd covered groceries another time. They'd still been late. I asked Elena, "Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged, "Because I am not interested in your family politics. I am interested in whether they pay. Mostly, eventually, they do." Then she added, "But I am old, and I no longer enjoy chasing adults." I took the papers home. I wish I could say I sat down and immediately decided to become some brilliant real estate guy, but that's not how it happened. For about 2 weeks I just stared at the numbers on and off while half-heartedly applying for jobs. Then I met with a loan officer. Then a small business banker Elena knew. Then an accountant. Then I ran the numbers again with worst-case repairs. Then I drove by the property at different times of day like a lunatic pretending I was discovering my own sister street for the first time. The house made sense. More than that, weirdly, it made emotional sense too. For years I had been playing emergency contact for grown adults who resented me for being available. I had spent so much of my life acting like stability was something you gave away to keep peace. The idea of putting my money into something tangible, something that paid me back instead of draining me, was new and honestly a little intoxicating. I also knew something else by then. Nobody in my family thought I was capable of anything except failing downward after the layoff. That wasn't self-pity, it was observation. Candace had started introducing me to people as, between jobs, but in that tone that really meant, not doing great. My mom asked 3 different times if I needed to move in with them. My dad sent me links to warehouse supervisor jobs making about half of what I used to earn. Eric asked if I was basically retired now. I didn't correct any of them. Partly because I didn't want their input, and partly because the less they knew, the more peaceful my life was. The next 3 months were the busiest I'd been in years. I picked up contract work through a guy the first knew from my old company, helping a local auto parts distributor clean up their inventory system. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep my expenses covered without touching much of my savings. I painted one of Elena's vacant units for a discount on rent. I learned more than I ever wanted to know about landlord insurance, city inspections, escrow, LLC filing fees, and how many forms a county can invent before noon. Elena owner financed the Patterson house to me because she trusted me and because she liked the idea of not dealing with banks any more than necessary. I put down a chunk of my savings, set aside reserves, formed an LLC, and had a very sobering week where I signed more papers than I thought one human hand should have to sign. No one in my family knew. That part wasn't some master revenge plan. It really wasn't. I didn't hide it because I wanted a movie moment. I hid it because every time my family got involved in my business, they found a way to make it about them. Also, I knew if Candace or my mom caught wind that I was even considering the house, they'd turn it into either a guilt campaign or a circus. And honestly, I didn't fully believe it myself until closing day. Closing was in July, hot as hell, one of those Ohio afternoons where the air feels wet. I wore the only decent collared shirt I hadn't emotionally associated with my old job. Elena brought homemade empanadas in a plastic container because apparently signing documents is hungry work. The title office was freezing. The woman handling the paperwork kept saying, "Congratulations," in a voice that sounded like she'd said it 1,200 times before. When it was done, Elena squeezed my shoulder and said, "Do not become one of the shaved apes." I laughed and told her I'd do my best. Then I sat in my car with the folder on the passenger seat and just stared at it. I had gone from fired and humiliated in March to owning a rental property in July. Not outright, obviously. I wasn't secretly a millionaire. But it was mine. I was responsible for it. The risk was mine, the upside was mine, the headaches were mine. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had built a door instead of waiting for one to open. The complication, of course, was still my family. Elena and I had agreed that she would notify the tenants she was selling once we were actually closed. No point stirring up drama early. She went over the afternoon before to tell Candace and Scott that ownership was transferring and the new landlord would drop off updated payment instructions and schedule a routine inspection over the weekend. She didn't tell them it was me. That was her choice, not mine. When I asked if I should call first, she said, "No. They have had many warnings in life about acting right. Let them have one surprise." So Saturday morning, I drove over with a folder containing the lease transfer notice, payment portal instructions, emergency contact information, and a standard inspection checklist. I remember my hands were sweating on the steering wheel, which was ridiculous because I wasn't doing anything wrong. But still, I knew what it was going to look like. I knew the second they saw me, every unkind thing they'd said to me in the last few months was going to come back and sit down at the table with us. Scott's truck was there. My dad's old Buick was there. Eric's battered Civic was also there, which meant he'd spent the night again. Great. I walked up to the porch. The screen door still stuck on the lower corner. I'd told Scott how to fix that twice. Candace answered in pajama shorts and a faded t-shirt, coffee mug in hand. She looked at me, then at the folder, then back at me. "Oh," she said, "you didn't say you were coming by." "I'm here about the house," I said. She frowned. "What does that mean?" Behind her, I could hear cartoons and my mom's voice from the kitchen. Scott yelled, "Who is it?" Candace, still looking confused, stepped back and let me in. The living room smelled like coffee, laundry detergent, and that sweet fake vanilla candle my mom always bought. My dad was in his recliner. Eric was at the table in yesterday's t-shirt. Scott came in from the hall scratching his chest. For one weird second it almost felt like any other Saturday, like I was just stopping by. Then I said, "Elena finalized the sale yesterday. I bought the property." Silence. Not movie silence. Real silence. Ugly, empty, stunned silence. Candace blinked at me once like she literally hadn't processed the sentence. Scott looked at me, then at the folder again. My mom came around the corner holding a dish towel, smiling at first because she thought somebody had said something normal. My dad slowly lowered the TV volume. Eric was the first one to speak. He laughed. I almost admired the consistency. He said, "Good one." I didn't answer. He looked at my face for maybe 2 seconds, and the laugh died right there. Candace said, very carefully, "What do you mean you bought the property?" I held up the folder a little. "I mean I'm the new owner. Starting August 1st, rent gets paid through my portal. I'm dropping off the transfer paperwork and I need to schedule a walkthrough for next week." Scott actually said, "Shut the hell up." Not loudly, more like his brain had pulled the phrase out of him before he had time to edit it. My mom sat down at the kitchen chair without taking her eyes off me. My dad said, "You bought this house?" I nodded. "With what?" I said, "My money, Dad." That probably sounds cold, but I had just enough bitterness in me at that point to enjoy it. Candace set her coffee mug down too hard on the table. No, Adam, this isn't funny. It's not a joke." Scott stepped forward then, still trying to square me standing there with paperwork in my hand. "Elena sold it to you? Why the hell would she do that?" I said, "Because I made her an offer." Eric said, "You got fired." I looked at him and said, yeah? In March. He just stared. My mom was the first to recover enough to reach for the angle she always reached for. Well, she said slowly, if it's you, then that makes things easier. I actually laughed then. I couldn't help it, not because it was funny, exactly. More because it was so immediate. So predictable. She hadn't even asked a single question about the terms, the lease, how it happened, anything. She just jumped straight to how it benefited her. I said, what things? Candace found her voice too. The rent, for one. Elena kept saying she'd have to raise it when the taxes went up, so obviously if it's staying in the family. It's not staying in the family, I said. All 5 of them looked at me. I went on, keeping my voice level because I had practiced this in the car like a psycho. It's a rental property owned by my LLC. The current lease stays in place until renewal. Same due date, same late fee. I'll need to inspect the property Wednesday or Thursday. Scott stared at me like I'd started speaking French. My dad said, Adam, don't be ridiculous. I turned to him. What part sounds ridiculous? The LLC part. The due date part. Don't come in here talking like a stranger. I said, then don't treat me like one when money is involved. That landed hard. Candace crossed her arms. So what, this is revenge? No. It sure looks like revenge. I held up the packet and said, this is ownership transfer paperwork. Revenge would look different. Scott muttered, Jesus Christ. My mom stood back up and moved into full guilt mode. After everything this family has been through, you're going to stand here and act like a landlord to your own parents? I said, you laughed when I got fired. Nobody said anything. I looked around the room, at all of them, and added, all of you did. Candace rolled her eyes immediately, which honestly made it worse than if she'd argued. Oh my God, are you still on that? We were joking. I said, I got laid off after 9 years and you all stood in the kitchen and laughed at me. Scott said, nobody laughed like that. Eric, probably forgetting himself, said, I mean, I laughed. Candace snapped, shut up, Eric. My dad rubbed his forehead like I was the exhausting one. This is exactly what I mean. You take everything so personally. I just looked at him. There's a point in some conversations where you realize the other people are not speaking in good faith. They're not trying to understand you. They're trying to get back to the version of reality where they aren't the problem. That was this conversation. So I stopped trying. I put the folder on the table and slid it toward Candace. Everything you need is in there. Rent portal, emergency number, mailing address if you want to pay by check, inspection notice, and a summary of the lease terms. She didn't touch it. Scott said, we're not doing an inspection. I said, yes, you are. He laughed once, angry. Or what? I looked at him. Or I enforce the lease. My mom made this wounded little noise in the back of her throat like I'd slapped her. Candace said, you cannot be serious. I am. She stared at me for a long second and then said the thing I think she really believed would crack me. You know we wouldn't even be in this house if it wasn't for family helping each other. I said, exactly. That shut her up too. Because we both knew what that meant. I was the one who had helped. I was the one who got them in the house. I was the one who covered part of the deposit and called Elena and vouched for them and told her they'd be good tenants. And 6 months later those same people had stood around a roast laughing because I lost my job. My dad finally said, quieter this time, so what happens now? I appreciated that question more than I should have. It was the first normal one anybody had asked. I said, now nothing dramatic happens if everybody follows the lease. Rent's due on the 1st. Grace period to the 5th. I'm doing a walkthrough this week because Elena said she hadn't been inside in a while. If there are maintenance issues, tell me. If something breaks, call the number. That's it. Scott looked like he wanted to keep fighting, but I think the fact that I wasn't ranting made it harder. There's not much to push against when someone is calmer than you want them to be. Candace finally picked up the packet like it might burn her. My mom stood with her arms folded so tightly under her chest she looked cold. Eric just kept staring at me with this weird mix of disbelief and, honestly, a little fear. I turned to leave, and that's when my mom said, you should be ashamed. I stopped at the door and looked back. She was crying. Real tears. Not full sobbing, but enough that her voice had gone thin. For making your family feel like tenants in their own home. I said, they're tenants. Then I left. I sat in my car for a while after that, parked halfway down the block under a sycamore tree, just breathing. My hands were shaking again. Not because I regretted it. More because adrenaline after family conflict feels gross in a different way than normal adrenaline. It makes you feel about 12 years old and 40 years old at the same time. I got 3 calls from Candace in the next hour and didn't answer any of them. Then a text. "Are you seriously doing this?" I wrote back. "I am seriously the landlord. So yes." She replied. "Unreal." I didn't answer. What came next was exactly what you'd expect if you've ever been cast as both the helper and the villain in the same family. They tried every angle. First came minimization. Candace texted me a giant paragraph about how I was twisting one bad dinner into some permanent grievance. Scott called and said, "Man to man, don't make this weird." My dad told me I was letting business poison blood. Then came guilt. My mom left a voicemail saying she couldn't believe her own son would make her feel unstable in her retirement years. Candace reminded me Lily and Owen loved that house. Eric texted, "Bro, this is kind of psycho if I'm being honest." Then came entitlement, which was the most honest phase. Candace asked if I could waive the late fee permanently because, you know how Scott's work is. Scott asked if he could pay part in cash and part later, like with Elena. My mom asked if I was planning to leave the rent where it is since family is in there. My dad wanted me to cover a plumbing fix myself without sending a licensed person because we don't need outsiders in the house. That was the weirdest part. Even after the shock wore off, even after they understood I really owned the place, some part of them still expected me to become a softer version of the same ATM I'd always been. They wanted all the authority of calling me family and none of the responsibility of treating me like one. I kept everything in writing. That was advice from Elena, who said, if people become emotional around money, make paper become your friend. So I answered by email. Polite, brief, professional. Inspection Wednesday at 5:30. Late fee terms remain per lease. All maintenance requests must be submitted in writing. No cash partials without a signed payment agreement. Scott hated that. He tried to corner me on the phone twice, probably thinking he could bulldoze me live the way he usually did at family gatherings. I stopped answering calls from him altogether. The inspection was a disaster, by the way. Not catastrophe level. The house wasn't destroyed, but it was obvious Elena had been right to want out. There was an unauthorized dog in the laundry room, despite the lease being no pets without written approval. Somebody had punched or kicked a hole into the hallway drywall about the size of a softball. The upstairs bathroom fan had been broken long enough that mildew was creeping across the ceiling. The back screen door had a torn mesh panel. The garage had enough junk piled in it to violate the fire code if the inspector was in a bad mood. And the sunroom window I'd personally helped Scott temporarily seal the previous winter still hadn't been properly fixed. Candace followed me room to room with her arms folded, defensive from minute one. "That hole was there," she said. "It wasn't," I said. Scott said, "The dog is temporary." I looked at him. "Temporary since when?" He didn't answer. My mom tried to distract by pointing out little cosmetic issues Elena had never fixed, like that somehow cancelled out the lease violations. At one point my dad said, "You're enjoying this." That bothered me enough that I stopped writing for a second. I turned to him and said, "No. I'm documenting my property." He looked away. The kids were the worst part. Lily knew something was wrong and kept hovering near the stairs, pretending not to listen. Owen asked me if they had to move because Grandma said you were mad. I crouched down and told him, no one has to move if the grown-ups handle grown-up stuff. Candace glared at me like I'd committed some crime by being calmer than she was. After the inspection, I emailed them a list. Repair requests, lease violations, timeline to cure. I wasn't trying to be punitive. I gave reasonable deadlines. I even approved the dog with an added pet fee once they submitted vaccination records because the dog, a black mutt named Pepper, clearly already lived there and the kids loved it. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, because about 6 weeks after I bought the house, they missed rent. Not all of it. They paid about half on the 3rd and then nothing else. On the 4th, Candace emailed saying Scott had lost 2 landscaping accounts because of rain delays and they'd make up the rest next week. No signed request, no payment plan proposal, just an announcement. I replied that the full amount needed to be in by the 5th to avoid the late fee and that if they needed a formal payment arrangement, I'd send one for signature. She didn't answer. The 6th came and went. No payment, so I posted a pay or quit notice. I did it exactly by the book. Printed, dated, photographed, mailed and posted. I hated every second of it, but I did it. My phone exploded within 20 minutes. First my mom, then Candace, then Scott, then my dad, then Eric, because apparently he had appointed himself family war correspondent. I let them all go to voicemail until I got a text from Candace that said, "If you do this to the kids, I'll never forgive you." That one I answered, "This is not, to the kids. Pay the rent or sign the agreement I offered." She called immediately. I picked up because I was angry enough to risk it. She was crying before she even got fully hello out. "How could you post that on the door?" she said. "Do you know how humiliating that is?" I actually laughed. A real, tired laugh. "Candace," I said, "you laughed when I lost my job." There was a pause, and then she did what she always did when cornered by a fact she didn't like. She changed the subject. "This is different." "It's not." "It is. This is our home. And when I got fired, my job was my home half the time." "Adam, no, you don't get to make this emotional only when it's happening to you." She got quiet at that. I could hear Scott in the background saying something, probably telling her what to say next. Finally she said, "So what, you just want to punish us?" I said, "I want rent on a rental property." She hung up on me. My dad came over to my apartment the next evening, which he almost never did. He stood on the little brick step outside my carriage house in khaki shorts and white New Balance shoes like every suburban father in Ohio. He looked older than I remembered. Smaller somehow. I invited him in. He said no. We stood outside while cicadas screamed in the trees and my neighbor's kid bounced a basketball down the alley. He said, "Your mother is beside herself." I said, "They didn't pay." He nodded once, slow. "I know." That actually surprised me. He shifted his weight and looked past me at the apartment, maybe noticing for the first time how simple it was. One bedroom, sloped ceilings, window AC unit humming its ass off. Then he said, "You know, when you were a kid, if you got your feelings hurt, you'd go dead quiet. Your mother always said that was the dangerous version of you." I said, "I'm not trying to be dangerous." "No? No." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Your sister thinks you've been waiting to get even." I said, "Your daughter thinks everything is about her." He actually smirked at that, which startled me. Then he sighed and said, "Scott's work has been bad." I said nothing. He added, "And I know we haven't always handled things right with you." That was the closest thing to an apology anybody in my family had managed yet, and even then it came wrapped in ellipses. I asked him, "Did you laugh because you thought it was funny, or because you were glad it happened?" He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And he didn't answer for a long time. Finally he said, "I think maybe I was tired of feeling like you were the one who had life figured out and the rest of us didn't." I appreciated the honesty, ugly as it was. "So you were glad I got knocked down," I said. He winced a little. "I didn't say glad. You didn't have to." We stood there another few seconds in the heat. Then he said, "What if they sign the payment plan?" "Then we have a payment plan." "And if they don't?" I looked at him. "Then the process keeps going." He nodded. He didn't like it, but he nodded. Before he left, he said, almost too quietly for me to hear, "For what it's worth, buying the house was smart." That was the first genuinely respectful thing he'd said to me in months. Candace and Scott signed the payment plan the next day. Not gracefully, not with humility, but they signed it, and because life apparently enjoys tension, that should also have been the end of it. It still wasn't. My Aunt Sharon got involved after my mom called her crying, which meant within 48 hours I had 3 cousins texting me variations of "Heard things are tense," and one Facebook post from Sharon about what this world is coming to when family weapon is hard times. She didn't use my name, but she didn't have to. Candace commented a sad face emoji. My mom commented, "Some hurts cut deepest when they come from your own blood." I did not respond online because I'm not 15 and because there's no winning Facebook. But I did save screenshots because once you start dealing with people sideways, receipts matter. Eric, who had somehow maintained the confidence of a man with no stable lease and several maxed out cards, tried to mediate. He came by my place with gas station coffee and sat on my little couch like we were old college buddies. He said, "Okay, I'm gonna be real with you. They were definitely jerks about the firing." I just looked at him. He raised both hands. "I'm admitting that. Growth. Congratulations." He ignored that, but also, man, the landlord thing is intense. I bought a property. You bought their property. I bought Alina's property. He leaned back and sighed. See, this is why people think you're smug. I laughed. Eric, you laughed when I got fired. He pointed at me. I know. I was being an asshole. That was, unbelievably, the first actual apology. He followed it with, but I also didn't think you'd become Mr. Monopoly about it. I said, I became the owner of an asset. You guys just can't stand that I didn't fall apart. That one he had no comeback for. He stirred his coffee and said, Candace says you're not the same. I said, maybe I got tired of being the same. That fall was tense in this long, low-grade way that made every interaction exhausting. I skipped most family dinners. When I did show up for the kids' birthdays or Thanksgiving, the room got stiff for the first 20 minutes and then everybody pretended very hard to be normal. Candace was overly bright. Scott either barely spoke to me or got weirdly performative, talking loud about the market and property values, like he wanted me to know he understood business now. My mom alternated between frosty and sentimental. My dad mostly watched. The only people I was completely normal with were Lily and Owen, because they were kids and none of this was their fault. I still took Lily to the bookstore. I still went to Owen's soccer game. I never mentioned the house unless one of them asked something direct. That mattered to me. I did not want to become the villain in a story children told themselves because adults couldn't act right. Financially, things actually got better for me. The contract work turned into a steady consulting arrangement. I picked up a second small property management client through Alina's recommendation. I refinanced some debt more efficiently than I ever had while employed because, ironically, I was paying more attention to my own life. I wasn't rich, still not, but I was building something. Every month the numbers made a little more sense. Every repair I handled taught me something useful. Every boundary I kept made me feel less like I was auditioning to be loved. Then in November, right before Thanksgiving, Candace called me crying again. Not angry crying this time. Actual frayed, exhausted crying. Scott had blown the transmission on his truck. Work was slow. My dad's prescription copays had jumped. They were going to be short again. Part of me was immediately furious because I knew the pattern. Emergency, emotion, Mia's solution. Another part of me just felt tired. I met her at a diner off Dorothy Lane because I didn't want this conversation in either of our homes. She showed up in an oversized coat with no makeup and looked older than 38. Like stress had physically pressed on her features. She wrapped both hands around her coffee and said, I know you think I'm manipulating you. I said nothing. She gave me a humorless little smile. Fair. Then she said, I am sorry about the way we acted when you got fired. I waited. She looked down at her mug. I was mad at you already. About money. About you saying no. About feeling judged all the time. Then when you lost your job, it felt like. She trailed off. Like what? Like maybe you weren't as above us as you acted. That hurt, mostly because it was honest and because I knew she didn't even fully hear how ugly it sounded. I said, I never thought I was above you. She rubbed her forehead, maybe not consciously, but when somebody always has to be the one asking and the other person always gets to decide, it doesn't feel equal. I sat with that for a second. Because as much as my family had used me, there was some truth there too. Not in the part where they laughed. That was still cruel, but in the imbalance. I had been the person with money and answers and spreadsheets. I had gotten used to feeling needed. They had gotten used to resenting it. None of that excused how they treated me, but it explained more than I wanted it to. Finally I said, do you need help or do you need to ask for leniency? She looked up. Both. At least she was honest. So we did what adults should have been doing from the start. We talked numbers, not feelings disguised as numbers. Real numbers. Scott's income, her substitute teaching hours, my parents' social security, expenses, debts, minimums, waste. It wasn't fun. She cried once out of frustration. I got annoyed twice, but by the end of it, I agreed to a short-term written payment adjustment through January, and she agreed that after the school year, they would either renew at the updated rate I'd already warned them about or move somewhere cheaper. No yelling, no guilt, just terms. As we got up to leave, she said, it's weird seeing you like this. I asked, like what? She thought about it, like you don't need us to tell you who you are anymore. That stuck with me, because for a long time, I had. I had spent years being whatever role kept the peace. Provider, responsible one, listener, backup plan. And when I stopped doing it the same way, everyone acted like I had changed into a colder person. But really, I think I had just become more visible, less convenient. By January, Scott had picked up enough snow removal work and a commercial account that they caught up again. My dad started treating me more carefully, which honestly was stranger than if he'd stayed gruff. My mom remained the most resentful because I think, in her mind, mothers are supposed to have emotional access to their children whether they've earned it or not. Eric bounced in and out like always but toned down the jokes after he needed a reference for an apartment, and I was the only person willing to tell the landlord he usually paid eventually. Then came the moment that really drove home how much things had shifted. It was late February, almost a year after I'd been fired. Snow melting, streets all gray and wet. I had gone by the house because the downstairs bathroom sink had a leak, and I'd brought a plumber. My dad was at the kitchen table doing a crossword. My mom was folding laundry. Scott was outside. Candace was at work. Pretty normal. The plumber went under the sink. I stood there with my little clipboard because apparently I own a clipboard now, which still makes me laugh. My dad watched me for a minute and then said, "When you got fired, I thought you were done." I looked over. "I know." He nodded, not defensive. "I didn't think you knew how to do anything if somebody else wasn't handing you the rules." That was rough to hear, but again, honest. I said, "I didn't know either, honestly." He gave this small grunt, almost approval. Guess we were both wrong. My mom kept folding towels and didn't say anything. A little later, after the plumber left, she finally did. Without looking at me, she said, "I still think family should treat family differently." I said, "I did. For years." That was all. She didn't answer. And that, more than the big dramatic reveal, was the moment I realized I was never going to get the apology or understanding I used to think would fix things. Some people can only relate to you inside the role they assigned you. Once you step out of it, they either adjust slowly or they spend the rest of their life insisting you were better when you were easier. When the lease came up for renewal that summer, I gave them the updated rate with plenty of notice. Still below market, because I wasn't trying to gouge anybody, but higher than Alina's old sweetheart number. Candace and Scott had a meltdown for about 2 days, looked at other rentals, realized the market had gotten worse, and signed. My parents were not thrilled, but by then even they knew they were still getting a better deal than most places. The signing itself was weirdly quiet. We sat at the dining room table where almost a year earlier they had laughed about my layoff. Same room, same overhead light with the pull chain that always clicked twice. Same scar on the table from Owen's science project Volcano. Candace had the new lease in front of her. Scott had a pen. My dad was standing by the window. My mom had her lips pressed tight together. I went through the basics. Renewal term, rate, maintenance procedures, parking note, pet addendum, standard stuff. Scott signed first, jaw tight. Candace signed next. Then my dad looked at me and said, not bitterly this time, still weird. I said, yeah. He almost smiled. My mom said, I suppose this is the world now. That was the most acceptance I was going to get from her, and I knew it. Candace slid the lease back toward me and said, you know what the wild part is? What? If you'd told me the day you got fired that a year later I'd be signing a lease with you, I would have laughed even harder. I looked at her for a second. Then I said, I know. And the room went completely still because everybody knew exactly which laugh I meant. Nobody apologized. Not right then. Probably not ever in the way people imagine apologies should sound. But nobody denied it anymore either. I collected the paperwork, put it in my folder, and stood up. On my way out, Lily ran in from the backyard and asked if I was still coming to her middle school orientation next week. I told her yes. Owen wanted to know if Pepper could have a bigger dog run someday. I said maybe if Scott cleared the garage like I'd asked 6 times. He yelled from the other room that he heard that. It was so normal it almost made me dizzy. I walked out to my car with the signed lease under my arm, and for a second I just stood in the driveway looking at the house. The same house I had once begged my landlady to trust them with. The same house where they laughed when I was at my lowest. The same house that, months later, paid my mortgage while I built a life nobody in that kitchen had imagined for me. I'm not going to pretend it felt purely triumphant. Real life usually doesn't. It felt complicated, sad in places, Funny in others. Vindicating, sure, but also clarifying in a way that's hard to explain unless you've had family only really understand your value once your signature is on the paperwork. When I got in my car that day, my phone buzzed with the rent notification from the portal. Paid in full, on time. I sat there looking at the screen and thought about that Tuesday morning in March, the cardboard box, the white envelope, the laughter over pot roast, the little crying laughing emoji my mom had sent to the family chat. And I don't know, maybe the strangest part of all of it was this. They thought losing my job was the moment my life cracked open. It turned out to be the moment theirs stopped having automatic access to mine.